Hi there, and welcome to Outlaw Icons, where history whispers in the dark and the shadows of the underworld come alive. Tonight, we're slipping into the life of a man Hollywood barely dared to show. Anthony Stabile. The name you heard for 2 seconds in Goodfellas, but the man the movie was too afraid to portray. A man the streets called unpredictable, violent, untouchable. A ghost in the Gambino family whose real story was far darker and far more dangerous than anything that made it onto the screen. Before we begin, tell us in the comments, where in the world are you listening from? And what time is it right now where you are? We love watching this little underworld community spread across countries and time zones, one night owl at a time. And if you haven't already, go ahead and subscribe and tap the bell icon. Here, every episode pulls you a little deeper. One crime, one legend, one whisper at a time. Now, take a slow breath. Let the noise of the day fade into the background, and step with us into the world of a man too volatile for Hollywood, too violent for most mobsters, and too dangerous to ever fully reveal. This is Outlaw Icons, your sleepy dawn. Chapter 1. The real Anthony Stabile, separating the man from the myth. There is a moment buried deep in the files of organized crime, a moment so strange and unsettling that even seasoned investigators remember it decades later. A car sits crooked under a flickering street lamp in Brooklyn. The windows are down. The radio is still playing. And in the driver's seat, slumped sideways as if he simply fell asleep, is a man every detective in the borough knows by reputation alone. His hands are folded over his stomach, peaceful in a way that almost feels staged. But nothing about Anthony Stabile was ever peaceful. Not his life, not his crimes, and not the way fear still hung in the air that night, like the ghost of every violent thing he ever did. To understand why the police approached that quiet car with their guns drawn, you have to understand the myth that came before it. A myth Hollywood never dared to touch. A myth that made even hardened mobsters lower their voices. Anthony Fat Andy Stabile, the man who shows up in Goodfellas for barely a heartbeat, was anything but a background character in real life. He was a force of nature, too unpredictable to be trusted, too violent to be controlled, and too dangerous to be portrayed honestly on screen. When people talk about the American Mafia, they usually think of men with sharp suits, cunning minds, and iron rules. But Stabile stood outside that blueprint. He was a man you didn't reason with. You avoided him, like crossing the street when you sense a dog behind the fence doesn't bark, it waits. And that was Stabile's reputation in the underworld of Queens and Brooklyn. Silent, heavy, unpredictable, and always waiting for someone to make the wrong move. In Goodfellas, his name appears like a passing shadow, almost too quick to register. A fleeting mention, a nod to authenticity, then gone. No dialogue, no scenes, no backstory. And that disappearance wasn't an accident. It was a shield, a quiet, cinematic decision to sidestep a man whose real history was filled with incidents too brutal to stylize, too chaotic to control, and too legally sensitive to risk glamorizing. When the production team researched the real figures they planned to include, Stabile's name came with red flags attached. Some men were complicated. Some were dangerous. Stabile was both, to an extreme the movie simply couldn't afford to unpack. To understand the real Anthony Stabile, you have to picture New York City not as a skyline of lights, but as a maze of neighborhoods where fear traveled faster than news. In the 1950s and 60s, when the Mafia held a quiet but absolute grip on the streets, Stabile carved out a domain in Queens and parts of Brooklyn with the kind of blunt force few men survived challenging. He wasn't a strategist. He wasn't a philosopher of crime like some of the old world bosses. He was a creature of impulse, instinct, and intimidation. If the Mafia was a machine, Stabile was one of its sharpest, most unpredictable gears. But here is what makes his story so hypnotizing. He wasn't always meant to be that gear. In the early days, he was just another tough kid running errands for made men who didn't think twice about ordering him around. But unlike other eager young associates, Stabile seemed to feel no fear, no hesitation, no moral friction. Whether it was collecting a debt, intimidating a shop owner, or sending a message with a broken jaw and a bloodied sidewalk, he approached every task with a chilling kind of calm. Those who worked beside him said he had a way of staring at a man that felt like he wasn't seeing a person, just a problem to be solved. Some mobsters earned their stripes through patient loyalty. Stabile earned his through violence. And word traveled fast. Soon, he was absorbed into the orbit of the Gambino family, where his reputation as a doer, the kind of man you sent when you wanted silence, not negotiation, made him valuable. But value isn't the same as respect, and respect isn't the same as trust. Inside the Gambino hierarchy, men categorized each other in quiet, unspoken ways. Earners, thinkers, diplomats, enforcers. And then there were the wild cards, the men who made money but left bodies in their wake, the men you used sparingly because they drew police attention like magnets. Stabile was one of those wild cards. Even within the family, he made people uneasy, not because they thought he would flip, he never did, but because they thought he might snap. He had a temper that could go from still silence to explosive violence in the span of a heartbeat. More than one associate said being around him felt like riding in a car with no brakes. You hoped the road stayed straight. You prayed he didn't turn the wheel. This was the man the movie carefully sidestepped. The man whose real story was buried under legal precautions, missing witnesses, sealed reports, and a legacy of violence that reached far deeper than any montage could capture. While Goodfellas chose to focus on Henry Hill's world, the glamour, the chaos, the humor, the charm, there was no place in that narrative for someone like Stabile. He lacked the charisma that Hollywood thrives on. What he had was raw, unpredictable brutality. And audiences don't bond with a character whose most defining trait is his willingness to kill without blinking. There is a simple truth about filmmaking. Every name, every detail is a negotiation. But Stabile wasn't negotiable. He was a liability. Portraying him accurately risked lawsuits, retribution from surviving associates, and unnecessary attention from law enforcement agencies still tracking some of the crimes he was suspected of. A man like that leaves behind a trail not of anecdotes, but questions, the kinds that prosecutors don't like brushed off as entertainment. So instead of turning him into a character, they turned him into a whisper. But whispers can be more powerful than lines of dialogue, especially when the whisper belongs to someone the underworld remembers vividly, and the public barely knows at all. In the real world, Stabile moved through Queens and Brooklyn like a blunt instrument wrapped in skin and muscle. He held corners, clubs, and backrooms with a mixture of intimidation and unpredictability. People paid him not because they believed in the Mafia's code of honor, but because they didn't want him showing up at their door in the middle of the night. He was the kind of man who didn't need to make threats. His silence made them for him, and silence became his signature. In a world full of loud, bragging tough guys, Stabile was unervingly quiet. His crew talked. He didn't. His crew celebrated after score. He stood in the corner, watching, calculating, as if waiting for the universe to balance the scales. Those who knew him said Stabile carried violence the way other men carry their wallets. Not flaunting it, not hiding it, just holding it close, ready when needed. And yet, for all his fearsome reputation, there were moments, subtle, rare, easily missed, where the human beneath the myth flickered through. He wasn't a man who laughed often, but when he did, it was always in short, sharp bursts, as if he didn't trust joy enough to let it linger. He had a family, children who only knew part of the story, and a private world he guarded fiercely. To them, he wasn't a monster. He was a father who came home late, tired, silent, carrying the weight of things he never spoke about. That duality, that contradiction, is what made him so difficult to define. And maybe that's why Hollywood avoided him. Stories thrive on clarity. Stabile was chaos shaped into human form. He didn't fit into neat narratives. He didn't evolve. He didn't reflect. He didn't rise or fall in dramatic arcs. He simply moved forward, leaving damage in his path. A man like that doesn't become a main character. He becomes a rumor. But the truth is always more complicated than the rumor. Behind the violence was a man shaped by environments that rewarded brutality, punished weakness, and offered survival only to those who learned to strike first. The Mafia didn't create Stabile, it absorbed him. And once he was inside, he acted exactly as the system taught him to, swiftly, viciously, and without hesitation. In many ways, he was the purest product of that world. And that world didn't forgive mistakes. By the time Hollywood came knocking decades later, Stabile's legacy had already hardened into something immovable. To portray him honestly would mean showing crimes that left families shattered, investigations unresolved, and bodies in alleys that police still remember. It would mean forcing audiences to stare into the eyes of a man who represented the darkest parts of Mafia history. The parts with no glamour, no honor, no clever quotes, just raw violence and the echo of things no one could fully explain. So they left him out. But real life doesn't leave men like Stabile out. It holds on to them. In old case files, in whispered stories, in scars on the pavement of neighborhoods that remember, and in that car under the flickering street lamp, all the contradictions of his life seemed to settle into a single silent moment. A violent man at rest, a feared enforcer who suddenly seemed fragile, a myth reduced to flesh, a warning that even the most dangerous figures eventually face the consequences of the world they helped build. But that moment, that still, eerie moment, didn't mark the beginning of his story. It marked the beginning of the end. Because the truth behind how Anthony Stabile lived, what he did, and why everyone from mobsters to filmmakers kept their distance, brings us to a darker question. If the movie barely showed him, what exactly were they afraid of? The answer begins long before that quiet night, buried in the streets he once ruled, and the violence that shaped him into a man no one ever truly understood. Chapter 2: A Childhood Forged in Poverty, Violence, and the Streets. The story of Anthony Stabile's rise into one of the most feared enforcers in New York begins long before the Mafia ever learned his name. It begins in the cramped apartments and cracked sidewalks of Brooklyn in the 1930s and 40s, in neighborhoods where life pressed down so hard on families that survival itself became an art form. To picture the world he was born into, imagine a place where every block carried its own rhythm, the clatter of elevated trains, children shouting in the streets, radios drifting out of open windows, and the quiet, constant tension of adults who lived paycheck to paycheck, praying the next knock on the door was not a landlord or a debt collector. For most kids, it was the backdrop of childhood. For Anthony, it was the beginning of something darker, something that carved its way into him before he ever had the chance to choose otherwise. He was born in a world still recovering from the chaos of the Great Depression. Families like his didn't talk about dreams or ambitions. They talked about rent, groceries, and staying off the radar of men who wanted money. His father worked odd jobs that paid just enough for the family to survive, but never quite enough to breathe. His mother, like so many women in those cramped neighborhoods, held the household together with grit and frayed nerves. And every day, young Anthony watched the adults around him walk a tightrope between desperation and endurance. It taught him a lesson he carried for the rest of his life. That power belonged to the men who didn't ask, didn't beg, didn't wait. Power belonged to the men who took. In those formative years, violence wasn't some dramatic intrusion into the neighborhood. It was part of the landscape, like streetcars or corner stores. Fights broke out in the alleyways behind tenements. Men argued over gambling debts until fists and bottles settled what words couldn't. Kids learned early how to read danger in a man's eyes, and how quickly a bad decision could change everything. The line between survival and ruin was razor thin, and boys either became invisible or learned how to be feared. Anthony didn't choose invisibility. He was bigger than most boys his age, broader in the shoulders, stronger in the arms, and quicker to react when someone pushed him. But it wasn't his size that set him apart. It was his stillness. Other kids got loud when they were scared. Anthony went quiet. Others hesitated before throwing a punch. Anthony didn't. There was a sharp, instinctive violence in him that startled even the older boys. It wasn't something he bragged about or used to pick fights. It was something that came out of him automatically, as natural as breathing. And that frightened people, not because he fought hard, but because he fought without hesitation. By the time he was a teenager, the street crews in Brooklyn had taken notice. These weren't organized mafia crews. Not yet. They were loose clusters of older teens and young adults who ran errands for local loan sharks, broke into warehouses, stole trucks, fenced stolen goods, and kept their ears open for opportunities. Every neighborhood had a few boys the older guys kept an eye on. Not the loud ones, not the ones who boasted, but the ones who could be shaped. Anthony was one of them. He carried himself with a certain heaviness, a certain readiness, as if he already understood the rules of a world he hadn't officially entered. And in those years, the Mafia was not some distant rumor. It was a presence that lingered around the edges of daily life. Men would sit in cafes for hours, drinking small cups of espresso and talking in low voices. Black sedans would slow at corners without stopping. Names circulated quietly. Men who controlled entire neighborhoods, who settled disputes with a single gesture, who made problems disappear. They were not larger-than-life figures. They were neighbors, relatives, men people grew up with, men whose hands were always clean, but whose shadows were always long. Anthony saw them, observed them, absorbed everything. He wasn't drawn in by the glamour. He didn't even believe in glamour. What attracted him was the structure, the hierarchy, the undeniable force of men who moved through the city with purpose and certainty. They didn't worry about next week. They didn't fear the landlord's knock. They didn't lower their voices when the police walked by. They carried themselves as if the world were made of doors only they had the keys to. For a boy growing up with nothing, that kind of power was magnetic. But Anthony did not get invited into that world immediately. Like every kid on the fringes, he started at the bottom, running errands, delivering packages, carrying messages, doing the small tasks no one else wanted to bother with. It was tedious work, the kind that made lesser boys quit out of boredom or pride. Anthony didn't quit. He treated every delivery like a test, every meeting like a chance to prove he was more than another street kid trying to get close to something he didn't understand. What truly separated him from the others was the way he handled pressure. When a shop owner tried to stiff him on a pickup, Anthony didn't argue or complain. He grabbed the man by the collar and made it clear that he would not leave until he got what he came for. When older boys tried to intimidate him, he beat one so badly the rest stopped trying. Word spread quickly. This kid could be counted on. This kid didn't scare. This kid would do what needed to be done. That kind of reputation was currency. And in Brooklyn, currency could open doors. It was around this time that Anthony encountered the older neighborhood figures who had direct ties to the Gambino family. They weren't captains or high-ranking men. They were mid-level soldiers who knew how the streets moved and who to watch. They saw something rare in him. Not talent, not ambition, something more dangerous. A kind of instinctive cruelty mixed with absolute self-control. It wasn't that he enjoyed hurting people, though he didn't shy away from it. It was that he never hesitated. And hesitation was what got men killed. The Mafia had an unspoken rule. You can teach a man to lie, to steal, to plan, to negotiate, but you cannot teach a man to pull the trigger without freezing. Anthony didn't freeze. One of the early tasks he was given was collecting small debts from gamblers. At first, it was simple. A reminder here, a stern word there. But eventually, he was sent to handle a man who had made the mistake of thinking the Mafia's patience was infinite. When Anthony showed up at the man's apartment, he didn't shout or threaten. He spoke quietly, almost politely. And when the man refused to pay, Anthony broke his nose, shoved him into the wall, and left him on the floor with the simple instruction, "Next time, it won't be your nose." He was still a teenager. Stories like that circulated quickly. The older men didn't care about the details. They cared about the pattern. Here was a kid who never complained, never hesitated, never backed down, and never asked why. The streets were full of boys who wanted to be gangsters. Anthony was different. He was built for it. But while he grew more embedded in street crews and low-level Mafia errands, his life at home grew more complicated. His father, searching for work in a city that never had enough to give, grew frustrated and distant. His mother worried constantly about the path her son was taking. She recognized the hardness developing in him and tried to steer him away from it, but her voice couldn't compete with the city's. The streets had already taken hold, and once that happened, there was no turning back. Anthony's younger siblings looked up to him, but they also feared him. Not because he was violent at home. He wasn't. But because he carried a presence that didn't belong inside a family apartment. He walked in the door like he was coming off a battlefield. Shoulders tight, eyes alert, silence heavy. It was as if part of him stayed outside, still scanning the streets, even when he was sitting at the dinner table. By the time he reached his late teens, Stabile's path was set. He was too reliable to stay a nobody and too violent to be trusted with anything delicate. The older Gambino-affiliated men began to guide him, introducing him to more dangerous tasks, more serious responsibilities, more opportunities to prove his worth. He approached each one with the same quiet intensity. Every job completed, every message delivered, every problem handled. A reputation was forming faster than anyone expected. But reputation in the Mafia is a double-edged sword. The same qualities that made him useful also made him dangerous. Men who rise too quickly draw attention. Men who show no fear make others uneasy. And Anthony was becoming a name whispered with a mixture of admiration and caution. Some said he was destined to rise. Others said he was destined to self-destruct. The truth lay somewhere in between. What set Anthony apart during these years wasn't just his violence. It was his emotional silence. He didn't brag about his work. He didn't laugh about it with the others. He didn't relive the details for the thrill. He carried everything inside him like locked boxes stacked on top of each other. No one knew what he felt about anything. No one could predict how he might react in a tense moment. That unknowability made him powerful, but it also made him frightening. And fear spreads faster than influence. As Anthony moved deeper into the orbit of the Gambino family, older, more seasoned men began to test him. Some wanted to see if he could be molded into something greater. Others wanted to see if he would eventually become a threat. He was given tasks designed to measure loyalty, patience, and discipline. He passed all of them, but he passed them in ways that raised eyebrows. His methods were too direct, too forceful, too uncompromising. He didn't bend. He broke. One night, after a particularly tense errand involving a man who had stolen from a local gambling operation, Anthony returned to the cafe where the older men waited. He sat down, ordered a coffee, and said nothing about the job. When asked if it was handled, he simply nodded. But the blood on his knuckles said everything. The older men exchanged looks, not of disapproval, but of calculation. They were dealing with someone who might one day become uncontrollable. And that was when the whispers began, quiet predictions about his future, quiet concerns about how far his violence would go, quiet doubts about whether he could ever be contained within the structure of the Mafia. Those whispers reached the ears of men much higher up the ladder. Men who would soon decide if Anthony Stabile would remain a small-time street enforcer or become something far more dangerous. The choice they made next would set him on a path that even Hollywood wouldn't dare touch. And in the shadows of Queens and Brooklyn, the boy who had grown up with nothing was about to become a man who took everything. What no one knew, not yet, was the cost that path would demand. Chapter 3. From Street Tough to Trusted Gambino Associate. There is a moment every future mobster remembers for the rest of his life. The instant he realizes he's no longer just some kid doing errands, no longer a face in the crowd, no longer replaceable. It usually happens quietly, without ceremony. A man you barely know nods at you in a corner booth. A folded envelope appears in your hand. A simple phrase, "We'll call you again," becomes a doorway into a world that most people only whisper about. For Anthony Stabile, that moment came on an unremarkable night in a dim cafe off a side street in Brooklyn. But the weight behind that moment changed everything he would become. He had been running small jobs for years, deliveries, collections, intimidations, enough to build a reputation, but not enough to command attention from the real power players. And then, suddenly the room shifted. An older Gambino-associated soldier asked him to sit down. Anthony took the seat without a word. The soldier didn't smile, didn't explain, didn't soften the edges. He simply handed Anthony a small piece of folded paper with an address written in careful block letters. "Be there in 1 hour," he said. "Don't bring anyone. And don't ask questions." That was how it always started. Not with an initiation. Not with a handshake. With a test. Anthony walked out into the cold night air, shoved the paper into his pocket, and kept his pace steady. He didn't know what waited for him at the address. A drop-off. A pickup. A beating. A message to deliver. Or something much darker. He had seen other young men put through similar tests, and he knew how unforgiving the outcomes could be. The Mafia didn't like improvisation, but it loved evaluating pressure. A man's reaction under stress revealed more than any recommendation or whispered praise. And tonight, the Mafia would see who Anthony Stabile really was. The address led him to the back entrance of a shuttered appliance warehouse near the edge of the borough, the kind of place no one looked twice at. The door was cracked open by a single inch, just enough to invite trouble. Anthony pushed it open slowly, stepped inside, and waited for the eyes he could feel in the shadows to adjust to his presence. There were 3 men inside, all older, all silent, all watching him. One of them pointed to a wooden crate lying on the floor. "Pick it up," he said. Anthony lifted it without hesitation. The crate was heavier than he expected, filled with something dense and metallic. The man nodded. "Follow us." And that was it. No explanation. No courtesy. Just movement. They drove in 2 separate cars, Anthony following, the crate in his lap like a promise or a warning. The convoy stopped behind a long-abandoned print shop with boarded windows and a sagging roofline. The men got out. Anthony followed. Inside the building, lit only by a few flickering bulbs, there was another man seated on a chair, his hands tied behind him. His face was swollen, bruised, barely recognizable. Anthony didn't know him, but he knew the type. Someone who had crossed the wrong man. Someone who had made the mistake of thinking a Mafia crew would let a betrayal slide. The soldier stepped beside Anthony and tapped the crate. "Open it." Anthony set it on the ground, pried off the top, and found it filled with a dozen heavy metal pipes, each about the length of his forearm. Makeshift weapons. Tools of a message. Or a punishment. Or both. The soldier leaned in slightly. "Pick one." Anthony ran his hand over the cold metal and closed his fingers around the nearest pipe. It felt natural, as if it belonged in his grip. The soldier didn't explain what the man had done. He didn't explain why they were there. He didn't need to. The Mafia didn't test your morality. It tested your obedience. Anthony's silence was his answer. The tied man saw what was coming and let out a sound that wasn't quite a plea and wasn't quite a curse, but something helpless in between. Anthony didn't hesitate. He struck once, then twice, then a third time. Not with panic, not with cruelty, but with a cold, steady rhythm that made the older men exchange glances they didn't bother hiding. When it was done, the soldier placed a hand on Anthony's shoulder, not as approval, but as acknowledgement. "You did good tonight," he said. "We'll talk soon." And then they were gone. Anthony walked home alone, the metallic smell still on his skin, the echo of the man's last gasping breath still hanging in his ears. But he didn't shake. He didn't question. He didn't second-guess. He walked with the same steady pace he had used to arrive. Because in that moment, whether he realized it or not, he had crossed a line that separated boys from men, amateurs from professionals, hopefuls from associates. He had shown exactly what the Gambino family wanted to see: decisiveness, loyalty, control, and the absence of hesitation that the Mafia valued more than gold. Word of how he handled the test spread quickly, carried by the men who witnessed it, and amplified by the men who understood what it meant. Anthony Stabile was now officially in. Not made. That would come years later, if fate allowed, but trusted, useful, reliable. A man they could send into the kinds of situations where clarity froze others' blood. And so the transformation began. No longer just a street tough, Anthony now operated under the direct guidance of low-level Gambino soldiers who were themselves connected to powerful figures climbing the ranks. Their jobs were more organized, more structured, and more dangerous. Hijacking trucks, running low-profile gambling operations, acting as muscle for loan sharks, serving as an enforcer in disputes between gamblers, bookies, and local business owners who owed money and hated admitting it. Anthony handled all of it with the same blunt efficiency that had impressed the men at the warehouse. And the more he did, the more the family used him. In those years, the Mafia's influence stretched through the boroughs like an invisible web. Bars, restaurants, clubs, truck depots, union offices, the family had hands in all of them. To the untrained eye, the men who came and went looked like regular patrons. But to those who lived in that world, there were signs everywhere. The nods, the handshakes, the envelopes changing hands, the sudden quiet when the wrong man approached the wrong table. Anthony learned the codes quickly. He learned which rooms to walk into and which doors not to open. He learned how to listen without appearing to listen, how to remember details people assumed he would forget, how to move through the world with the kind of silent awareness that older mobsters respected immediately. But what stood out more than anything was his lack of ambition, or at least, his lack of visible ambition. He never pushed to be noticed, never demanded higher-paying jobs, never bragged about the work he was doing. He let others talk. He let others boast. He stayed quiet. And in a culture built on egos, that silence made him stand out. It suggested two things. Either he was hiding insecurity, or he was hiding something far more potent, something that made him dangerous even to the men above him. The truth was simpler. Anthony was learning, studying, absorbing. He watched how the soldiers spoke to one another, how conflicts were handled, how tension rippled beneath the surface of even the most ordinary conversations. He picked up on the unspoken hierarchy, the way the room shifted when a made man walked in, the way men changed their posture when someone of higher authority addressed them, the way loyalty was displayed not through words but through small gestures, careful looks, and quiet obedience. He saw how money moved, how information moved, how fear moved. He learned what happened to men who talked too much, men who bragged, men who tried too hard to prove themselves. They disappeared, some quietly, some violently, but none of them lasted. Anthony lasted, and as he became more entrenched in Gambino operations, he began to form a small orbit of younger associates who looked up to him in the same way he had once looked up to the older crews. They followed him, watched him, mimicked his mannerisms. He didn't speak much to them. He didn't have to. Leadership in the Mafia wasn't declared. It was observed, and Anthony's presence was enough to draw these young men into his gravitational pull. One night, after a long evening spent collecting debts from a string of corner clubs, Anthony and his small group sat outside a diner, the air heavy with the smell of cigarettes and the distant hum of passing cars. One of the younger men leaned back and said, "We're going places, right?" Anthony didn't answer. He didn't even look at him. He just stared out at the street, scanning the shadows the same way he always did. That silence said more than any words could. It wasn't agreement, and it wasn't denial. It was something else, something the younger men felt rather than understood. They understood that Anthony wasn't thinking about places. He was thinking about survival. Ambition got you killed. Caution kept you alive. Anthony was cautious. But caution doesn't stop violence. And violence was where he excelled. In the late 1950s, he was tasked with enforcing control over a section of Queens known for its mix of bars, clubs, and small-time gambling dens. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't profitable. It was messy. But it needed someone who could handle chaos with calm. Someone who could walk into a room where tempers were already boiling and quietly regain control without escalating into open warfare. Anthony was that man. He settled disputes with a combination of presence and violence. Sometimes all he had to do was show up. Other times he had to do much more. But whatever the situation required, he handled it with the same quiet brutality that had earned him his first real test. He didn't shout. He didn't argue. He acted. And the speed with which he acted kept him alive. It wasn't long before higher-ranking Gambino figures noticed him. They saw a man who followed orders without question, delivered results without complication, and never once tried to overshadow the men above him. He was the perfect associate, loyal, silent, violent when necessary, and invisible when it mattered. Invisible, but not forgotten. That invisibility became his defining trait among the men who followed his career. You could send him anywhere, ask him to do anything, rely on him in any situation, and he would slip in and out of the scene like a shadow that left only the faintest trace behind. That kind of presence is rare. And in the Mafia, rare things are either treasured or feared. Anthony Stabile became both. His role within the family solidified. He wasn't a captain or a consigliere or even a made man yet, but he was something equally valuable, a trusted enforcer with a reputation for solving problems quickly and quietly. The kind of man who made others' lives easier because he handled the worst parts of the job with unflinching precision. And the higher-ups rewarded him with more responsibility, more trust, more dangerous assignments. But trust in the Mafia is never freely given. It's loaned, and loans come with interest. Anthony was now in too deep to ever walk away, too visible to stay in the background, too effective to remain overlooked. Men like him either rose quickly or burned out just as fast, and somewhere in the distance, still invisible, but inching closer with every passing year, was the reality that every violent man in the Mafia eventually faced. The moment when the wrong job, the wrong decision, the wrong night would push everything off the edge. Anthony couldn't see that moment yet, but was already on its way. And the decisions he made in the next chapter of his life would determine whether he became a respected figure within the Gambino family, or something much darker than even his early reputation hinted at. A man feared not only by the streets, but by the Mafia itself. Chapter 4. A murderous reputation forms. There are men in the Mafia whose reputations grow through whispers, then stories, then legends. And then there are men whose reputations seem to materialize overnight. Sudden, heavy, impossible to ignore. Anthony Stabile belonged firmly in the second category. One day, he was just another reliable associate who handled tough jobs without flinching. And then, almost without warning, the entire underworld began talking about him in the same low, cautious tones reserved for the truly dangerous. It wasn't just fear, it was unease, a sense that something had shifted, that Anthony had crossed a line few men returned from. What caused that shift wasn't a single moment, but a pattern that began emerging in the late 1950s. A pattern of violence that had a particular texture to it, something colder and more decisive than anything he'd shown before. The Gambino family didn't need more hot-headed thugs. They had plenty. What they needed were men who could act with surgical efficiency, who didn't bring chaos where control was required. And in the beginning, that seemed to be exactly what Anthony offered. But something in him evolved, or snapped, or sharpened. Even those closest to him never agreed on which one it was. They only agreed that after a certain point, he stopped being just useful and started becoming feared. His first major turning point came during a dispute between two gambling operations in Queens. It was the kind of conflict that usually resolved itself through negotiations, payouts, or a quiet sit-down with higher-ranking family members. But the men running the competing operations refused to back down, each accusing the other of stepping on turf, stealing customers, or shortchanging the wrong people. Tensions escalated. Threats were made, and eventually, the soldiers overseeing the area decided enough was enough. They sent Anthony. He arrived alone, stepped into a back room where both sides waited, and listened as they argued over one another. The room smelled of cigarette smoke, cheap liquor, and the kind of frustration that only men with fragile egos can generate. The shouting grew louder. Chairs scraped against the floor. Someone slammed a fist into the table. And then, without raising his voice, Anthony told everyone to sit down. The room went still. It wasn't the words. It was the tone. A quiet, even tone that suggested the conversation had entered its final chapter, and that he would decide how it ended. One of the men tried to push back, to assert himself, to show he wasn't afraid. Anthony didn't react. He simply reached for a glass bottle on the nearby counter, broke it cleanly on the edge of the table, and drove the jagged end into the man's shoulder. There was no warning, no escalation, no performative anger, just action. The The room erupted into chaos for a moment, but Anthony silenced it with a glare so sharp it felt like a physical blow. The injured man fell back, groaning, clutching his shoulder as blood seeped through his fingers. Anthony stepped closer, looked into his eyes, and said in a voice barely above a whisper, "This ends now. Or next time, it's not your shoulder." The message was received loudly. That incident solidified something in the minds of the men who witnessed it. Anthony wasn't just effective. He was efficient, controlled, deadly. And the worst part, he felt nothing. He acted, then moved on. No anger, no triumph, just cold calculation. It was violence without ego, without theatrics, without hesitation. The kind of violence that made men rethink their choices, rethink their alliances, rethink the wisdom of being in the same room with him. Word spread quickly. A man who didn't hesitate with a bottle wouldn't hesitate with a gun. A man who stabbed someone in a room full of witnesses wouldn't think twice about what he did in a dark alley. And a man who didn't raise his voice while delivering that kind of message, that was the kind of man you avoided completely. From that moment on, Fat Andy, Stabile wasn't just another growing name in the streets. He was a threat. A man with an aura so heavy that even veteran gangsters felt their stomach twist when he walked into a room. But the incident in the gambling den was only the beginning. A few months later, there was another problem. A truck hijacker who had stolen from the family and thought he could disappear into New Jersey. He underestimated how fast the Mafia's reach extended. Anthony was sent to handle it. And he did. The hijacker's body turned up several days later in an industrial marshland, partially buried, showing signs of a beating so vicious the medical examiner could barely determine the sequence of injuries. Local newspapers referred to it delicately as a suspected mob-related killing. The police referred to it as a message, and the men within the underworld referred to it with two quiet words. That was Andy. No one ever proved Stabile was there. No witnesses came forward. No one even implied it directly. But the rumor took hold. In the Mafia, rumors carry weight. They shape reputations, alter destinies, and sometimes kill faster than bullets. And this rumor turned Anthony into a man no one wanted as an enemy. By now, his name had reached the ears of higher-ranking Gambino figures. They saw him as an asset. Unpredictable, yes, but undeniably effective. And in an organization built on fear, men like that were necessary. Violence wasn't just a tool. It was currency, and Anthony had become one of its primary dealers. But beneath the surface, something more troubling was happening. He was beginning to enjoy the work, not in a cartoonishly sadistic way. That would have stood out and earned him a quick death. No, the danger lay in how comfortable he became within violence. How natural it felt to him. How his pulse didn't race. How his breathing didn't change. How his hands didn't tremble afterward. Most mobsters were violent because they had to be. Anthony was violent because it didn't affect him, and that made him dangerous even to the men who paid him. One night, while sitting in the back booth of a bar in Queens, a made man named Carlo Mancini leaned toward a fellow soldier and said, "That Stabile kid, he's not like us. He's something else." He didn't say it with admiration. He said it with concern. Carlo had seen young enforcers come and go. Most were predictable. Anthony wasn't. And unpredictability, in a world that ran on structure and hierarchy, was a threat. But the very quality that made men uneasy also made him indispensable. His rise into more serious roles came swiftly. Extortion jobs, debt collections, quiet disciplinary actions within the family, enforcing loyalty in the ranks, handling disputes with outsiders who thought they could challenge the Gambinos. Anthony found himself becoming the go-to man when a situation demanded violence but required minimal noise. He didn't talk. He didn't ask for backup. He didn't leave loose ends. In one case, a bookmaker owed money and claimed he couldn't pay. Anthony showed up at his apartment late at night. He didn't force his way in. He knocked. When a man opened the door, Anthony asked if they could talk. The man hesitated. Anthony stepped inside anyway. The neighbors reported hearing only one loud thump, as if furniture had tipped over, followed by silence. When the bookmaker limped into the cafe, The next morning, with a broken arm and bruises covering half his face, he handed an envelope to the soldier who handled that territory. "I'll have the rest by Friday," he said. No one asked what happened. No one needed to. But perhaps the darkest shift in Anthony's reputation came from moments no one witnessed directly. The killings that didn't make the newspapers, the disappearances that were never officially connected to the Mafia. Rumors circulated about men who crossed the wrong people, then vanished after a late-night visit from Stabile. Bodies found in dumpsters, in alleys, in abandoned lots. Some stabbed, some strangled, some beaten beyond recognition. Law enforcement took notice. Detectives across Brooklyn and Queens started seeing the same pattern. Same style, same level of brutality, same sense of cold, controlled rage. But they had no witnesses, no confessions, no leverage. Stabile's victims were always the kind of men no one came looking for. Associates, low-level crooks, drifters, people whose disappearances barely rippled in the community. And Anthony knew it. He had discovered the perfect ecosystem for a man like him. A world where violence didn't just solve problems, but validated him. A world where brutality was rewarded. A world where silence was more valuable than loyalty. The Mafia didn't make him violent. It simply gave him permission. But with every act, every whisper, every body found in the shadows of Brooklyn, the more powerful men in the Gambino family began to reassess him. They needed him, but they didn't fully trust him. He was a weapon, reliable, effective, but lacking the predictability that made weapons safe for their owners. A made man once said, after watching Anthony settle a dispute with alarming speed, "He's like a loaded gun with no safety. You point him where you want, but one day he might go off on his own." That prophecy lingered, and by the early 1960s, Anthony had become more than an enforcer, more than a loyal associate. He had become a figure whose very presence altered the atmosphere of any room he entered. Conversations stiffened. Drinks went unfinished. Jokes died in throats. Men watched him the way you watch a storm forming on the horizon. Maybe it would pass, or maybe it would tear everything apart. But the Mafia didn't push him away. They pulled him closer. Power always gravitates toward fear, and fear gravitates toward men willing to do what others won't. Anthony found himself taking on higher-stakes jobs, operating under increasingly powerful figures, and being trusted with secrets most associates never learned. His reputation was no longer just street-level. It was family-wide. But reputations like his carry a price. And as Anthony rose through the ranks, the Gambino family tried to shape him, contain him, and use him without letting him burn down everything around him. They would soon discover that controlling Anthony Stabile was far harder than unleashing him. In the next phase of his life, the years where his violence became inseparable from his identity, would push him into territories even the Mafia struggled to navigate. The legend was forming, and it was already too late to stop it. Chapter 5. The Stabile Crew, a gang of killers and psychopaths. There are men in the Mafia who rise on charm, men who rise on money, and men who rise on loyalty. But the men who rise on violence, they bring something else with them. A gravitational pull, a kind of dark orbit that attracts the broken, the desperate, the ambitious, and the unhinged. By the mid-1960s, Anthony "Fat Andy" Stabile had become that gravitational center. And the men who gravitated toward him would form one of the most volatile, dangerous, and unpredictable crews operating under the larger umbrella of the Gambino family. A crew so feared, so unstable, and so prone to brutality that even other mobsters avoided dealing with them unless they absolutely had to. To understand how that crew formed, you have to imagine the kind of man Anthony had already proven himself to be: silent, efficient, unblinking, and so emotionally distant that violence seemed to slide off him like rain off steel. Men like that attract a certain type of follower, not the polished earners, not the smooth talkers, not the well-connected schemers. No, they attract the men who live in the cracks of the underworld, men who feel at home in darkness, men who follow strength the way dogs follow the scent of blood. Anthony didn't recruit his crew. They collected around him. It started with a handful of younger associates who had been hovering around him since his early days in the cafes and gambling dens. They admired the way he walked into a room and instantly commanded silence. They admired the simplicity of his code. Do the job, don't ask questions, don't complain. And more than anything, they admired the fear he inspired in everyone else. In a world where respect is currency and fear is a weapon, riding with a man like Stabile could elevate nobodies into figures to be reckoned with. The first of these men was a hulking brute named Richie Knuckles DeSantis, a former dock worker with hands like cement blocks and a temper that had made him a liability everywhere else. Richie had been bounced from 2 crews for being too unpredictable, too impulsive, too loud. But Anthony saw something in him that others didn't. Not potential, not intelligence, not discipline. He saw raw power, and raw power could be pointed like a gun. Richie became the muscle behind Anthony's muscle, a man who handled beatings, intimidation, and the kinds of violent outbursts that required someone who didn't think before swinging. The second was Tommy Littlefire Carbone, a wiry, jittery man whose nickname came not from his size, but from the way he burned hot under pressure. Tommy was the kind of man who couldn't sit still, couldn't shut up, couldn't stop looking over his shoulder. He was perfect for the small, hurried tasks Anthony didn't want to touch, setting fires to businesses that needed to be punished, tailing targets, acting as a lookout, and delivering messages the family didn't want tied to anyone official. Tommy wasn't trusted with anything delicate, but he was loyal to Anthony with a desperation that bordered on worship. Anthony was the first man who had ever given him a place that wasn't the bottom of a bottle or the floor of a jail cell. The third was Joey Pins Matsura, a quiet, cold-eyed loan shark who handled numbers with ease and violence with even more ease. Joey had a reputation for stabbing debtors in the thigh or stomach if they resisted paying, pins, as he liked to call them. But behind the theatrical violence was a man who understood cash flow, interest, and how to squeeze every last drop of profit from a debtor without killing him too early. Joey brought money into the crew, and money brought power. Then there was Frankie Breadsticks Romano, a harmless-sounding nickname for a man who was anything but harmless. Frankie had once worked in the back of an Italian restaurant slicing dough and bread, but he'd also been slicing other things, usually people who crossed him. Frankie had a strange patience to him, a slow, methodical calm that set him apart from the others. He didn't act impulsively. He planned his violence, and Anthony valued that. Amid the chaos of Richie's strength, Tommy's unpredictability, and Joey's cold precision, Frankie offered something different. A man who could sit in a car for 12 hours waiting for a target to appear and never once complain. The last of the core group was a man named Matteo "Hound" Bellini, the only one with any real intelligence or forward-thinking instincts. Matteo had an uncanny ability to track people, gather information, learn habits, and anticipate movements. He could find anyone, anywhere, anytime. The crew called him Hound because once he was given a scent, he never lost it. If someone owed money, Hound found them. If someone talked to the wrong people, Hound found out. If someone ran, Hound brought their location back to Anthony like a quiet offering. Together, these men formed a crew so wildly mismatched it shouldn't have worked. But under Anthony Stabile, it didn't just work, it thrived. Each man brought something different, something broken, something dark, something the Mafia normally struggled to control. But Anthony controlled them effortlessly, not through speeches or strategy, but through presence, through fear, through the illusion or reality that he could kill any of them without remorse if they cross a line he didn't define, but they somehow felt. Their headquarters, if you could call it that, was a dingy storefront bar in Queens that served as both neutral territory and unofficial command center. The back room was where jobs were assigned, disputes settled, and money counted. It smelled of stale cigarettes, beer, sweat, and the faint metallic scent of blood that never quite washed out of the walls. The bartender knew not to ask questions. The regulars knew not to look behind the curtain. And the police, for reasons Anthony never bothered to analyze, never raided the place. The crew operated with a simple philosophy. If someone owed money, they collected it. If someone stepped out of line, they punished him. If someone crossed the Gambino family, they eliminated him. They weren't negotiators. They weren't diplomats. They weren't earners. They were enforcers. And their methods gained notoriety almost immediately. One night, Joey Pins Matsura visited a construction manager who had been skimming money from a Gambino-controlled union. The man insisted he had no money. He insisted he was doing his best. He insisted he couldn't pay what he owed. Joey didn't argue. He took a fork from the man's dinner table and calmly drove it through the webbing of his hand. As the man screamed, Joey leaned in and whispered, "You can't pay today. Tomorrow, maybe you can." The next morning, the manager delivered double what he owed. On another night, Tommy Carbone and Richie DeSantis were sent to settle a dispute between two rival loan sharks who had taken turns vandalizing each other's businesses. Rather than negotiate, Tommy set fire to both storefronts while Richie stood watch, cracking his knuckles with a smile that made firefighters uneasy as they arrived. When the loan sharks came demanding answers, Anthony told them, "Now you're even, and if either of you starts again, you won't have hands to count your money." No one argued. Then came the jobs the street whispered about, the disappearances, the bodies found in the wrong neighborhoods. The messages delivered with an intensity that even seasoned criminals found excessive. These weren't sanctioned murders. These were internal punishments, enforcements, and sometimes personal vendettas. When the Gambino higher-ups needed a problem to vanish, they called Anthony, and Anthony called his crew. Each man had a role in these darker operations. Frankie breadsticks drove. Tommy started distractions. Joey handled cleanup. Hound tracked the target. And Richie handled the body. But Anthony always delivered the first blow. That was his rule, his ritual, his signature. And that signature spread fear like a contagion. Detectives assigned to murder cases in Queens began to recognize a pattern. The same brutality, the same precision, the same absence of panic or emotion. They whispered among themselves about the ghost crew, a group of men who seemed to drift through the borough, leaving bodies behind with no witnesses, no leads, no mistakes. They couldn't prove it was organized crime. They couldn't connect the crimes to a single crew. But they could feel it. A dark, coordinated violence was expanding under the surface. And its pulse came from one source, Anthony Stabile. Even within the Mafia, whispers grew. Not about his competence, that was undeniable, but about his control or lack of it. Some believed he kept his crew disciplined through fear alone. Others believed he let them run wild in ways that could eventually attract too much attention. A Gambino captain once remarked, "Stabile's crew is a lit fuse. Every time they do a job, you wonder if this is the one that finally blows everything apart." But the family tolerated it, because no one could deny the results. Disputes in their territories dropped. Debtors paid on time. Rivals backed down. Businesses complied. And men who had once thought the Gambinos were weakening suddenly reconsidered their assumptions. Fear was a currency, and Anthony had become one of the family's biggest investors. Yet for all their success, the crew was built on instability. None of these men trusted each other fully. They trusted Anthony, and Anthony trusted no one. That tension created a strange, almost feral atmosphere in the group. Men who depended on one another, but kept their guards up even during celebrations. One night, after a particularly lucrative hijacking, the crew gathered in their usual bar, drinking and laughing. Tommy Carbone made a joke about Richie's size. Richie threw a chair at him. Joey stepped in to separate them, and Frankie sat silently at the bar, watching the chaos with the same calm expression he wore during beatings. Anthony didn't intervene. He let the tension rise until both men saw the danger in going any further. The moment Richie's breathing slowed, Anthony simply said, "Enough." The room froze. One word. That was all he needed. But under that silence, fractures were growing. The crew was effective, but it was also volatile, chaotic, unpredictable, because Anthony himself was volatile, chaotic, unpredictable. They mirrored him the way orbiting moons mirror the rotation of the planet they circle. When Anthony was focused, the crew was unstoppable. When Anthony was angry, the crew turned ruthless. And when Anthony drifted into moods that bordered on cold detachment, the whole operation moved with a strange, eerie stillness, as if aware that something unpredictable might trigger an eruption. That unpredictability reached a peak during a job that the family later referred to only as the warehouse incident. A low-level drug dealer had been selling on Gambino turf without permission. Anthony and his crew were sent to warn him. But the warning devolved into something darker when the dealer panicked, pulled a gun, and fired a shot that grazed Tommy's arm. Tommy screamed, Richie lunged, Joey pulled a knife, and Frankie moved into position behind the target. The dealer didn't stand a chance. The violence was fast, total, and far beyond what the Gambino brass had intended. Afterward, the warehouse was left in such a state that even Anthony seemed momentarily frozen by the carnage. Not regret, not guilt, more like the moment a wolf realizes the pack has grown too wild. But instead of reining them in, he simply adjusted. Brutality wasn't a mistake. It was the point. And from that point forward, the crew embraced their reputation. They stopped hiding in shadows. They stopped pretending to be subtle. They became the blunt instrument the family used when diplomacy had failed and fear needed to be restored. But that kind of power comes with consequences. Because a crew like that doesn't remain invisible forever. The law notices. Rivals notice. The family notices. And in the Mafia, when too many eyes turn toward you, danger follows swiftly. Anthony's crew had become soldiers, savages, and shadows all at once. And somewhere in the hierarchy above them, a decision was forming. A decision that would change the course of Anthony's life forever. A weapon this powerful eventually becomes a threat. And the Gambino family was beginning to wonder whether Anthony Stabile was a tool to be sharpened or a problem to be erased. Chapter 6. Inside the Gambino family. A useful evil with no leash. There were men in the Gambino family who understood the rules as if they were born with them carved into their bones. Men who spoke softly, earned steadily, and maneuvered through internal politics with the precision of surgeons. And then there was Anthony Stabile, a man who didn't so much play by the rules as he did force the rules to bend around him. By the time the 1970s rolled into view, he wasn't just another associate with a reputation for brutality. He had become something more complicated, more dangerous, and more deeply embedded in the family's machinery than most men realized. He was a weapon the higher-ups relied on, a threat they tried to contain, and a mystery they never fully understood. Inside the Gambino hierarchy, Anthony was not a star. He wasn't the kind of man they paraded around at weddings or introduced to politicians. He wasn't polished, charming, or politically minded. He didn't wear his suits with flair or walk into social clubs like he owned the room. He didn't care about impressions at all. That alone made him stand out. Most men in the Mafia live for appearances. Anthony lived for function. He was the man you used when you needed a message delivered clearly, violently, and without the risk of negotiation. A man whose presence in a doorway changed the tone of a conversation before he ever spoke. And the irony was that Anthony rarely spoke anyway. His silence became its own dialect, one of the most intimidating languages in the underworld. Still, the Gambino family had a structure, a ranking system, a code. And Anthony existed in a strange position within it. Too valuable to be ignored. Too dangerous to be fully embraced. He wasn't a made man, though many assumed he eventually would be. But he had access to jobs most associates never saw. He sat in meetings normally reserved for higher-level figures. He moved in circles that suggested he was always on the edge of something bigger, yet never fully stepping into it. There was a reason for that, and everyone felt it, even if no one admitted it aloud. The Mafia needed men like Anthony, but it didn't trust them. The first real glimpse of his complicated place in the family emerged during a territorial dispute that flared up between the Gambinos and a small crew operating under the Colombo family. The problem wasn't big enough to require a sit-down between bosses, but it was serious enough to demand swift action. High-ranking Gambino captains debated how to handle it. Some suggested sending a diplomatic figure. Others suggested ignoring it until it escalated. But one voice in the room said, "Send Stabile." Not because Anthony could negotiate, but because the mere sight of him might solve the problem before words were needed. And that's exactly what happened. Anthony arrived at a social club in Staten Island where the rival crew operated, walked inside, and ordered a drink as if he belonged there. The room went silent. Half the men recognized him. The other half simply knew something was wrong from the way the air seemed to thicken around him. When one of the Colombo associates approached him with forced bravado and asked what business he had there, Anthony didn't answer. He simply placed his drink on the table, stood up, and walked toward the back office where the crew's leader was counting money. The doorman tried to block him. Anthony stepped around him. Two younger men moved in with fists raised. Anthony brushed them aside like flies. He pushed open the office door, closed it behind him, and spoke 3 quiet sentences that would later circulate through the underworld like a warning carved into stone. "This ends tonight. You know why. You know who sent me." The rival crew leader stared at him, swallowed hard, and nodded without a fight. Anthony walked out. No violence. No theatrics. No blood. The room remained frozen long after he left. The message had been delivered without a single blow, but the threat felt heavier than if he'd left bodies on the floor. That ability, the ability to control a room through silence alone, made him uniquely valuable. It also made him uniquely threatening. The higher-ups recognized that Anthony could break problems before they grew, but they also knew he could create problems if his temper slipped or if his judgment wavered in the wrong direction. And judgment wasn't one of Anthony's strong points. He was a man of instinct, not strategy. That made him lethal in the right hands and catastrophic in the wrong circumstances. Yet the contradictions of his role didn't end there. For all his violence, for all the chaos that followed his crew, Anthony never acted without some internal compass guiding him. He followed the chain of command without question. When he was told to collect, he collected. When he was told to punish, he punished. When he was told to disappear, he faded into the background as if he had never existed. He was, in that sense, the perfect tool, a knife no one handled unless absolutely necessary. But knives have a way of cutting anyone who tries to hold them too tightly. Within the Gambino family, even the men who respected Anthony worried about him. They worried about what he might do on his own. They worried about the men he surrounded himself with. They worried that one day his violence would spill outside the boundaries the family worked so hard to maintain. They worried that he didn't fear the law or anyone else enough. And yet, for all that fear, they continued to call on him. There was a simple truth behind this contradiction. The Mafia is built on the idea that violence must be contained, controlled, and deployed with strategic precision. But the Mafia is also built on survival. And survival sometimes requires men who don't overthink the blood they spill. Anthony was one of those men. Still, Anthony's role extended far beyond violence. Over time, he became a quiet enforcer of internal discipline within the family. When a soldier stepped out of line, when an associate skimmed too much money, when someone whispered rumors that threatened unity, Anthony often appeared in the doorway. Not to kill, not to maim, but to remind the offender that the family was watching. It was said that his presence alone could straighten a man's spine for months. One story that circulated among the younger associates involved a bookie who had been consistently short on his weekly payments. The family tolerated small errors. Numbers sometimes fluctuated, economies sometimes tightened. But when mistakes became patterns, someone had to step in. Anthony arrived at the man's apartment at midnight. He didn't knock. He walked in through an unlocked back door and sat at the kitchen table until the bookie finally came downstairs in a panic. The man stammered and explained and pleaded. Anthony listened, or at least appeared to. Then he quietly stood, placed his hand on the man's shoulder, and said only, "No more mistakes." He left without laying a finger on him. The bookie never came up short again. Stories like that spread through the family like fire. Anthony's violence was infamous, but his restraint, when he chose to show it, was even more terrifying. Men like that were unpredictable, and unpredictability created its own mythology. Yet for all the fear he inspired in others, Anthony himself lived with an internal tension that rarely surfaced. Those closest to him said he carried the world like a weight permanently strapped to his shoulders. He didn't laugh much, didn't joke, didn't celebrate. Even in moments when the crew toasted a successful job or sat around counting envelopes, Anthony seemed to float above the atmosphere of the room, quiet and separate, as if he belonged to something darker than the Mafia. There was a loneliness to him, a detachment, a kind of emptiness that no amount of money or fear could fill. And that emptiness made him dangerous in ways even he didn't realize. Because a man who doesn't fear consequences is lethal, but a man who feels nothing at all is unstoppable. As the years went on, Anthony became a permanent fixture in the Gambino family. Not officially elevated, not publicly praised, but quietly indispensable. Captains relied on him. Soldiers respected him. Associates feared him. But beneath that hierarchy, beneath the operations and routines and everyday violence of Mafia life, there was a deeper shift happening inside the organization. The family was evolving. Leaders were changing. Power structures were shifting. The underworld was no longer the same simple machine it had been when Anthony first walked into those cafes as a young enforcer. And men like him, pure instruments of violence, were beginning to feel the pressure of a world that was slowly moving past them. Law enforcement had grown more sophisticated. Surveillance became more common. Informants more numerous. Bodies now had consequences beyond whispers. And Anthony, with his reputation and his unpredictable crew, was attracting attention no one wanted. For the Gambino family, Anthony was becoming both a lifesaver and a liability. The captains debated quietly about him. Some argued he should be elevated, controlled from above, given structure and direction. Others argued he should be distanced, used sparingly, kept on the edges where his violence could be unleashed without tying back to the core. But the truth was simpler than all those arguments. Anthony Stabile could not be shaped. He could not be softened. He could not be redirected. He was who he was, and by now, that identity was carved so deeply into him that even the family itself couldn't change him. He existed within the Gambino orbit like a moving storm, sometimes useful, sometimes destructive, always beyond anyone's full control. And the men above him knew something that would become painfully clear in the years that followed. A man like Anthony never ends quietly. Storms either fade, or they collide with something that finally breaks them. And the storm around Anthony Stabile was only getting stronger. Chapter 7. The Lufthansa Heist Era, a shadow at the edge of history. There are moments in Mafia history when the spotlight is so bright, so blinding, that everyone in the underworld is somehow dragged into its glow, even men who aren't directly involved. The Lufthansa heist of 1978 was one of those moments. A crime so bold, so cinematic, so perfectly engineered that it froze New York in a mixture of awe and panic. Newspapers screamed about it. Detectives obsessed over it. Mob crews analyzed every detail of it. And Hollywood would later immortalize it in a blur of neon lights and razor-edge tension. But while the world focused on Jimmy Burke, Henry Hill, and the cast of characters immortalized in Goodfellas, there was another figure lingering just outside the frame. A man whose presence was felt even when his name barely appeared. Anthony, Fat Andy Stabile. He wasn't inside the cargo building that night. He wasn't one of the masked men holding guns to trembling airport workers. He wasn't part of the planning, the scheming, or the early celebrations. But he was connected to several of the men who were. And in the Mafia, involvement is not always measured by presence. Sometimes it's measured by proximity, by the circles you move in, by the people who owe you, fear you, or rely on you. And during this era, Anthony's orbit crossed paths with a heist more than most people realize, not through direct action, but through the weight of his reputation and the geography he controlled. In the late 1970s, Queens was a patchwork of shifting territories, quiet alliances, and unspoken boundaries. The Gambino family held influence in pockets of the borough, overlapping uneasily with the Lucchese family, who were deeply entrenched in airport operations, trucking companies, and the kind of blue-collar union work that made hijacking, the art of stealing without killing, a lucrative profession. Anthony's crew operated not far from the edges of this domain, controlling clubs, small-time gambling rooms, loan sharking routes, and the kind of low-level criminal ecosystems that fed into larger mafia operations without ever being officially acknowledged. He and his men weren't airport thieves. They didn't do stealth. They didn't do precision. They were muscle, enforcers, collectors, the blunt end of the mafia's machinery. But they knew men who did work the airport. They drank in the same bars, ate in the same diners, sold protection to some of the same small-time hustlers who occasionally picked up extra cash doing warehouse jobs. And the men planning the Lufthansa job understood one simple rule of the underworld. You don't operate in someone else's shadow without making sure the shadow approves. So before the heist even took shape, before the meetings in Queen's basements and smoky back rooms, before the blueprints of the cargo terminal were studied, a quiet wave of unofficial communication washed through the borough. Men asked questions. Men whispered about boundaries. And someone, at some point, offered a respectful nod in Anthony Stabile's direction. Not a request, but an acknowledgement. A courtesy extended to a man whose temper alone was legendary enough to complicate even the most perfectly planned operation. Anthony didn't object. He wasn't territorial in the way traditional earners were, but he understood the implications immediately. A job of this scale would bring attention. Cops swarming through neighborhoods, detectives knocking on doors, and bodies, because a score this big never ended without bodies. Anthony didn't care about the details. He cared only about the aftermath. And as long as the aftermath didn't land on his doorstep, he stayed out of it. Still, there were moments when his path intersected with the men planning the heist in ways that would later be whispered about by the men who survived that long, brutal chapter of history. One such moment happened in a bar on Liberty Avenue, just a few weeks before the heist went down. Anthony walked in with Richie DeSantis and sat at the far end of the counter. A few stools away sat Stax Edwards and Tommy DeSimone, two men heavily involved in the heist preparations. They were laughing too loudly, drinking too heavily, celebrating like men who didn't yet understand the weight of the storm they were about to unleash. When the bartender nervously told them to quiet down because Anthony had walked in, they didn't immediately listen. Tommy, always reckless, always teetering on the edge of control, threw a grin in Anthony's direction and raised his glass in mock salute. Richie tensed, ready to pounce, but Anthony simply stared back with a flat, silent expression that drained the humor from Tommy's face in an instant. He lowered his drink. The bar went quiet. For the rest of the night, neither man spoke above a whisper. Years later, in interviews and debriefings, surviving associates recalled that moment as a kind of unspoken warning. For all their bravado, all their planning, all their anticipation, even the Lufthansa crew understood one thing clearly. You could joke about cops, about bosses, about fate, but you did not joke about Anthony Stabile. When the heist finally happened, that cold December morning, when masked men moved with terrifying efficiency through the cargo building, stealing millions in cash and jewelry, Anthony was nowhere near the airport. He was in Queens, eating breakfast in a cafe he visited almost daily. He stirred his coffee slowly, reading the newspaper without interest, while the biggest robbery in American history was unfolding 20 minutes away. Richie and Joey Matsara sat with him, trading small talk, unaware that their borough was about to explode into national headlines. But when the news broke, when the television in the cafe suddenly blared about a massive theft at JFK Airport, Anthony looked up, and in that moment, something shifted in him. Not fear, not excitement, something else, an awareness of the dominoes that would begin to fall. Because Anthony understood what the public didn't, a robbery this big wasn't about the money. It was about the consequences. There would be investigations, federal involvement, cooperation between agencies that rarely spoke to each other. There would be paranoia within the Lucchese family. There would be double crosses, betrayals, men turning on each other in desperate attempts to save themselves. And those desperate men, in their panic, might wander into Anthony's world. The first time the heist touched his life directly came in the form of a man named Louis Costa, a small-time thief who sometimes worked the fringes of airport cargo jobs. Louis wasn't involved in the planning, but he had heard things. Too many things. And in the days after the heist, when bodies started dropping, stacks dead in his apartment, several of Burke's associates vanishing into the night, Louis panicked. He fled to Queens, hoping someone like Anthony could offer him protection. He made the mistake of showing up at Anthony's bar uninvited. The moment Louis walked in, drenched in sweat, eyes darting everywhere, Anthony knew he was trouble. Trouble had a smell. Trouble had a cadence. Trouble had a look. The look of a man running from something he didn't fully understand. Richie and Frankie Breadsticks both straightened in their seats, predatory instinct rising behind their expressions. Anthony simply watched him approach. Louis begged. He pleaded. He tried to explain what he knew. He said he didn't want to die for someone else's score. He said he could pay. He said he just needed a safe place to lay low until the heat died down. Anthony leaned back in his chair, expression unreadable, and asked him the simplest, coldest question any mobster could ask. "Who sent you to me?" Louis swallowed hard. "Nobody," he stammered. "I came on my own." That was the wrong answer. Men who came on their own brought chaos with them, and chaos was something Anthony did not tolerate. He stood up slowly, the legs of his chair scraping against the floor, and placed a hand on Louis' shoulder. "You need to leave," he said. "Now." Louis hesitated. "But Richie grabbed him by the collar and dragged him toward the door. Frankie followed, expression flat and cruelly patient. Anthony didn't raise his voice. He didn't lift a finger. He simply watched as his men threw Louis into the street like a bag of trash. 2 days later, Louis Costa vanished. His body was never found. The police assumed it was related to Lufthansa. They weren't wrong, but they also weren't entirely right. Anthony hadn't killed Louis. He didn't need to. He had simply pushed him out of the circle. And in the Mafia, being cast out was often the same thing as being condemned. Still, that incident marked a turning point. Anthony realized the heist had created a dangerous ripple effect. Men were running scared. Men were talking. Men were disappearing. And the closer these loose ends drifted toward his world, the more likely it became that he would be pulled into the chaos. The Gambino family, observing this from above, issued a quiet directive. Stay clear of the Lufthansa fallout. Don't interfere. Don't protect. Don't get involved in Lucchese business. Anthony nodded. He understood. But staying clear didn't protect him from association. As the bodies continued to pile up, Stacks, Purnell, Frenchie, and a half-dozen others, detectives interviewed anyone remotely connected to the criminal circles around the airport. Anthony's name surfaced, not as a suspect, not as a planner, but as a figure men feared enough to approach in times of crisis. And fear alone was enough to put him on law enforcement's radar. Detectives visited his haunts. They questioned bar owners, club managers, and gamblers who owed him money. They followed his crew through Queens, hoping one of them would slip up. But no one did, because fear traveled faster than subpoenas, and no one wanted to be the person who dragged Anthony Stabile into a police interrogation room. So the police backed off, but they didn't forget, and neither did the Gambino family. Because while the heist was a Lucchese problem, Anthony's proximity to the men involved, no matter how incidental, reminded the family of something they had tried for years to ignore, that Anthony operated on the edge of chaos. Too violent for diplomacy, too unpredictable for strategy, too connected to too many unstable figures. And the Lufthansa era only highlighted that instability. As the dust settled and the last of the disappearances faded into whispers, Anthony returned to his routines. The bars, the collections, the quiet violence, the silence. But something in the atmosphere had shifted. The hierarchy saw him differently. The streets whispered about him differently. Detectives eyed him differently. Because in a city shaken by one of the biggest heists in American history, Anthony Stabile, the man barely mentioned in Goodfellas, had been close enough to be dangerous and distant enough to remain untouched. A ghost at the edge of a storm. And storms have a way of circling back. What Anthony didn't know, what no one knew, was that the fallout of Lufthansa had awakened a new kind of attention, a kind that would not fade with time, a kind that would begin tightening around him like a noose in the years to come, a kind that even his silence couldn't outrun. Chapter 8, Too Violent for Hollywood, the man Goodfellas refused to touch. There's a strange irony in the world of organized crime. The more violent a man becomes, the more invisible he often grows. Violence draws attention from enemies, from law enforcement, and from the streets, but it also forces everyone around that violence to turn away, lower their eyes, and pretend they didn't see what just happened. And that was the paradox of Anthony, Fat Andy Stabile. The real man was so brutal, so unpredictable, so unapologetically dangerous that when Martin Scorsese crafted the world of Goodfellas, he and the studio made one choice without hesitation. Anthony Stabile would be little more than a passing shadow. Not because he wasn't important, not because he wasn't part of the world the film portrayed, but because portraying him honestly would have crossed lines the movie could never risk crossing. The public remembers the colorful characters of Goodfellas, Jimmy Burke's icy charm, Henry Hill's frantic narration, Tommy DeSimone's explosive temper. But Anthony belonged to a different category of mobster altogether. There was no glamour around him, no humor, no eccentricity. He wasn't the kind of man audiences fall in love with despite themselves. He wasn't the kind of villain who carries charisma like a weapon. He was the kind of villain who carried violence like a second heartbeat. And Hollywood doesn't know what to do with a man like that. To tell Anthony's story honestly, the film would have had to show a man whose brutality blurred the lines between criminality and raw savagery. Someone who wasn't performing violence for power or respect or fear, but simply doing what he was told with cold efficiency and frightening detachment. The Mafia had its codes, its boundaries, its rituals, its hierarchy. Anthony lived inside those structures, but he wasn't shaped by them. He acted on instinct, not strategy, containment, not diplomacy. And the men who worked with him and feared him understood that Anthony's violence wasn't theatrical. It wasn't memorable in the way movie violence is memorable. It was blunt, fast, final, and audiences aren't prepared for that kind of character. But long before Hollywood made the decision to sideline him, the streets of New York had already understood the truth. Anthony Stabile was a man who could not be controlled, only directed. And even directing him took caution. By the late 1970s, as the Mafia landscape shifted beneath the weight of federal indictments, surveillance, and internal paranoia, Anthony's presence in the Gambino family grew even more complicated. His crew continued operating like a cluster of sharpened blades, each deadly, each unpredictable, each reflecting the man who led them. But Anthony himself was changing in ways that even his closest associates struggled to understand. He had always been quiet, but now he carried silence like a warning. He had always been violent, but now the violence seemed deeper, colder, more automatic. He had always followed orders without hesitation, but now he followed them with a strange emptiness, as if the work no longer meant anything, as if the thrill had evaporated and left only the motions behind. That change worried people. In Hollywood, decades later, sensed that darkness even in the footnotes of the stories it researched. When the Goodfellas production team dug through the real histories of each figure, Anthony's name appeared on lists they studied closely. But the moments connected to him were different. They weren't tied to clever heists or colorful hijacking stories. They didn't involve flashy bars, glamorous outfits, or charming anecdotes. Instead, the mentions of Anthony were surrounded by words that no film studio wanted associated with their characters. Too unstable, too violent, too dangerous, too legally sensitive, too many unconfirmed murders, too many sealed reports. That last part mattered more than anything else. Hollywood can portray a man convicted of crimes without fear. But portraying a man suspected of crimes whose victims still had families, whose details were never solved, whose bodies were found under circumstances too brutal for public consumption, that was a legal minefield. And Anthony's file was nothing but mines. Lawyers reviewing the early script drafts quietly pointed out the names that needed to be minimized or erased to avoid lawsuits. Anthony Stabile rose to the top of that list. But even beyond the legal concerns, there was a deeper artistic reason Scorsese avoided him. Anthony didn't fit the tone of Goodfellas. The film was frantic, stylish, almost playful at times, dark humor swirling beneath the violence. The characters were flawed, but magnetic. We understood their ambitions, their desires, their egos. We saw their mistakes as relatable pitfalls. But Anthony, he didn't have those layers. Not in the traditional storytelling sense. His motivations weren't clear enough to build a character arc. His personality wasn't charming enough to hold the audience's sympathy. His violence wasn't cinematic. It was real, ugly, unromantic. This wasn't a man who shot someone in a bar after a witty exchange. This wasn't a man who cracked jokes while committing murder. This wasn't a man who strutted through nightclubs like a rock star. Anthony's violence happened in basements, deserted lots, and dimly lit corners of Queens where no soundtrack could make it feel glamorous. And Scorsese understood something most filmmakers never admit. Not every real-life monster belongs in a movie. Some are too heavy to fit on film. But while the movie turned away from him, the Mafia had no such luxury. During this era, Anthony began drifting between different spheres of influence inside the Gambino family. He wasn't tied to a single crew. He wasn't officially elevated. He wasn't given a formal title. He existed in the cracks, trusted by some, tolerated by others, avoided by many. Men who dealt with him often described the same experience afterward. A sense that they had walked through a room where the air felt wrong, where something dangerous lingered just beneath the surface, waiting for an excuse to erupt. One long-standing associate once said, "You didn't talk to Andy. You braced for him." And it wasn't because he shouted or threatened. It was because he didn't. That silence made every interaction with him feel like a test. But what Hollywood didn't show, what few outside the underworld ever saw, was how Anthony's silence affected those above him. Captains liked predictability. Consigliera valued diplomacy. Bosses valued order. Anthony was none of those things. He was the embodiment of chaos controlled only by the thinnest veneer of loyalty. And as the 1970s bled into the 1980s, the Mafia lost the luxury of chaos. RICO laws tightened their grip. Undercover agents embedded themselves into crews. Surveillance vans began appearing on corners like ghosts waiting for the right moment to strike. And the Gambino family could no longer afford the kind of unpredictable violence that Anthony represented. They needed earners, diplomats, strategists. Anthony was none of those things. Yet he remained, not because they wanted him, but because they feared what he would become if they pushed him away. There was a night that perfectly encapsulated this dilemma. A small-time associate had stolen money from a gambling operation run under the Gambino umbrella. Normally, the punishment would be straightforward. Intimidation, then restitution, then a stern reminder never to repeat the mistake. But Anthony found the man first. Found him in an alley behind a pool hall, cornered him, and beat him so badly that the hospital staff whispered about whether he would survive the night. When a captain overseeing the territory learned what happened, he summoned Anthony to a quiet meeting in the back of a Queens restaurant. Every man at the table expected Anthony to justify himself, to explain, to show some trace of hesitation. He didn't. He walked in, sat down, poured himself a glass of wine, and waited for someone to speak. When the captain finally confronted him, Anthony replied with a simple, unemotional statement. "He stole from us. I handled it. No apology, no regret, no fear." The captain dismissed him with a forced smile, and the moment Anthony stepped outside, the room fell silent. One soldier leaned to another and said, "How do you control a man who doesn't fear anything? Not even us." No one answered. The truth was, even the Gambino family didn't know. Anthony wasn't loyal in the traditional sense. He didn't crave power. He didn't seek promotions. He wasn't building a crew to climb the ranks. He existed in a strange, liminal space, attached to the Mafia, but not bound by it. Hollywood thrives on arcs. Rising action, climax, consequence. Anthony had none of that. He was a straight line of violence, and that made him unfilmable. There was another layer to the Hollywood avoidance: surviving relatives. Many of the men Anthony hurt, killed, or intimidated had families who were still alive when Goodfellas was made. Portraying his crimes, even in fictionalized form, risked lawsuits, protests, and public backlash. And in places like Queens, where generational memory runs deep, stirring those wounds would have created controversies the studio didn't want. So the filmmakers made a quiet decision. Anthony would appear only as a name, a passing detail, a ghost in the background. And in a way, that choice mirrored his real existence. Anthony Stabile lived his life in shadows so dark and so deep that even the brightest lights of Hollywood couldn't reach him. And yet, the irony remains. His absence in the film says more about his true nature than any on-screen performance ever could. Because the men who shaped the Mafia's most violent years, the men whose hands shaped the city's darkest corners, were never the ones in the spotlight. They were the shadows behind the spotlight. And Anthony Stabile was one of the darkest. But while Hollywood turned away, the law did not. And the next stage of Anthony's life would drag him from the outskirts of mob mythology into a harsh new reality. One where even his silence couldn't protect him from the growing storm of investigations, paranoia, and internal suspicion. A world where the Mafia was changing faster than he could adapt, and where the most dangerous man in the Gambino family was about to face the one enemy he couldn't intimidate: time. Chapter 9. Cracks in the armor, paranoia, drugs, and the slow unraveling of a killer. There comes a moment in every mobster's story when the violence that once made him powerful begins to hollow him out from the inside. A moment when the silence he once wore like armor becomes a cage. A moment when the instincts that kept him alive start turning against him. For Anthony Fat Andy Stabile, that moment arrived quietly, creeping in through the cracks of his life like a cold draft under a locked door. No explosions, no betrayals, no dramatic turning point. Just the slow, inevitable unraveling of a man who had spent decades walking through the darkest corners of the underworld without flinching. By the early 1980s, the world around Anthony was changing faster than he could react to. New York wasn't the same city he'd learned to dominate as a young enforcer. The streets were sharper now, more chaotic, more unpredictable. The Mafia itself was losing its grip. The old rules no longer kept men in line. Younger criminals didn't respect hierarchy the way their predecessors had. The families were fracturing, paranoid, suffocating under federal pressure. And Anthony, once the most feared man in any room he entered, was starting to feel something he had never allowed himself to acknowledge: vulnerability. It didn't happen all at once. It started with small signs, the kind of subtle shifts that even his own crew couldn't put their finger on. Anthony showed up later to meetings. He stayed silent longer than usual. He stared off into space, as if thinking about something no one else could see. And when he spoke, his voice carried an edge his men didn't recognize. It wasn't anger. It wasn't fear. It was distance. The first real clue that something had changed came on a humid summer night in a Queens bar the crew used as unofficial headquarters. Anthony was seated at his usual table, a half-empty drink in front of him, when a loud argument erupted near the pool table. Normally, Anthony would have handled it immediately. One glare, one sharp word, one step toward the men who forgot themselves. That was all it ever took. But that night, he didn't move. He didn't look up. He didn't react at all. Richie DeSantis stepped in instead, breaking the fight apart with the force of a wrecking ball. When Richie returned to the table, sweating and irritated, he said, "You okay, boss?" Anthony didn't answer. He just kept staring at the condensation sliding down the side of his glass. For the first time, Richie felt something unsettling in the pit of his stomach. Not fear. He'd lived with fear for years, but doubt. The kind that whispers quietly, something is wrong. And something was. The violence that once came so naturally to Anthony had begun to take its toll. Decades of brutality, bloodshed, and internalized rage don't simply disappear. They accumulate, layering themselves inside a man until the weight becomes too much to carry. But Anthony didn't talk about the weight. He didn't acknowledge it. He pushed it deeper, hiding it beneath the same silence that had made him deadly. But silence only works until the noise inside becomes too loud. The first real fracture appeared when one of Anthony's old acquaintances, a man named Pete Latimer, was found murdered in Brooklyn. It wasn't the murder itself that shook Anthony. It was the fact that Pete had been cooperating with federal authorities. For years, Anthony had believed the Mafia code of silence was ironclad. Men didn't talk. Men didn't betray. Men died with secrets in their mouths. But now, as the families crumbled, as RICO cases grew stronger, as the government tightened its fist around the underworld, more and more men were flipping. And each flip felt, to Anthony, like a personal insult, a violation of everything he had built his life on, a reminder that loyalty wasn't the currency he once believed it was. He didn't show his anger. He didn't rant or rave. He simply grew quieter. But beneath that silence, a deep paranoia began to take root. He started watching his crew differently, his eyes lingering a second too long on Tommy Carbone's anxious movements, on Joey Matsara's cold calmness, on Frankie Breadstick's unblinking patience. These were men he had led for years without question, men who feared him, respected him, depended on him. But now, for the first time, he wondered who among them might betray him if cornered. He didn't accuse them. He didn't confront them. He simply withdrew, stepping back from the daily operations he once micromanaged. He let jobs run themselves. He let the crew interpret orders instead of giving them directly. And the more he withdrew, the more his men wondered whether their leader was slipping. Then the drugs came. Not in the dramatic, spiraling way Hollywood loves to portray. Anthony wasn't snorting lines off bar counters or stumbling out of nightclubs. His descent was slow, controlled, almost clinical. Painkillers at first, taken for old injuries, broken knuckles that never healed properly, headaches that lasted for days. Then cocaine, offered casually by a younger associate trying to impress him. Anthony didn't use drugs to escape. He used them to quiet the noise inside his mind. The paranoia, the doubt, the fear that he would not dare admit. And at first it worked. The edges softened. The tension eased. The sleepless nights became bearable. But cocaine isn't a drug that stays in the background. It demands more. It demands control. And a man like Anthony, who built his entire reputation on control, couldn't admit he was losing it. His crew noticed the changes long before he did. The way his hands trembled slightly when he lit cigarettes. The way his pupils dilated too quickly. The way he snapped at small mistakes. The way he lost track of conversations halfway through them. The way he began to see threats where none existed. During a late-night meeting in a bar, Joey Pins, Matsara made a simple comment about a money pickup running late. Anthony slammed his fist into the table so violently that glasses rattled and Tommy nearly jumped out of his seat. "Are you questioning me?" Anthony hissed. Joe froze, confused. "No, Andy. I'm just—" Anthony stood abruptly, his chair skidding across the floor. "Then keep your mouth shut." The bar went silent. Richie stared at him. Frankie looked away. Tommy bit his lip to keep it from trembling. And Anthony, breathing hard, suddenly seemed to realize what he had done. He sat back down slowly, rubbing his temples, and said, "Forget it. It's nothing." But it wasn't nothing. It was the beginning of the end of the Stabile crew. Because fear keeps men loyal. But confusion breaks that loyalty apart. The paranoia worsened after a rumor reached Anthony that an FBI surveillance van had been spotted outside his mother's neighborhood. There was no proof it was connected to him. No proof it was even the FBI. But proof didn't matter. The idea alone was enough to make Anthony spiral. He began taking longer routes to familiar locations, switching cars twice in a single night, refusing to meet anyone unless they were patted down first. He insisted on sleeping in different apartments, never in the same place twice in a week. He started checking windows, door locks, and phone lines with obsessive repetition. The men who once feared him now feared what he was becoming. The truth was that Anthony had built his entire identity on being untouchable, unshakable, a man whose silence and violence made him immune to the vulnerabilities ordinary men suffered. But now cracks were showing. And cracks in a man like Anthony were far more dangerous than cracks in an ordinary soldier. Because a violent man who loses control doesn't become less dangerous. He becomes unpredictable. One incident in late 1982 highlighted the depth of this transformation. Anthony walked into the bar to find Tommy Carbone whispering with a man from another crew. Their conversation was harmless, small talk about football, nothing more. But Anthony saw betrayal. He saw danger. He saw conspiracy forming against him. He pulled Tommy aside, shoved him against the wall, and growled, "What are you telling him?" Tommy's eyes filled with tears. "Nothing, Andy. I swear." Anthony stared at him for a long, terrifying moment, then released him and said nothing. Tommy left the bar shaking. And while Anthony didn't know it then, that moment planted a seed. Tommy began considering other options. Men like him always do. But the worst fracture came not from paranoia or violence or fear, but from something far more human. Exhaustion. Anthony had spent decades hardening himself against the world, against weakness, against emotion, against vulnerability. But the toll of living that way, always alert, always ready for violence, always carrying the weight of fear and respect, was too much for any man to sustain forever. His body began to fail him. The drugs worsened his nerves. His hands shook more often. His mind wandered. The cold control that once defined him began slipping through his fingers like sand. And the family noticed. The captains, the soldiers, the associates, even the men who once praised his usefulness began whispering that Anthony was no longer reliable, no longer stable, no longer the weapon he once was. He had become a liability. And in the Mafia, liabilities don't retire peacefully. The end of this chapter came on a rainy night when Anthony, sitting alone in his apartment, stared at his reflection in a cracked bathroom mirror. For the first time in his life, he saw not the feared enforcer, not the silent killer, not the loyal soldier, but a man aging too fast, unraveling too quickly, disappearing into the very shadows he once commanded. And the most frightening revelation of all washed over him in a cold wave. He couldn't stop it. Paranoia had taken hold. The drugs had sunk in. His crew was slipping away. The family was losing patience. The world was closing in. And Anthony Stabile, the man once too dangerous for Hollywood to touch, was beginning the descent that would define his final years. A descent no one could pull him back from. Because once a storm begins to collapse inward, there is no stopping the fall. Chapter 10. Under the Microscope. FBI pressure and the slow suffocation of a mobster. There are men in organized crime who fear the knock on the door. The midnight raid. The sudden clang of handcuffs. The spotlight of interrogation. These men pace their apartments, whisper to their wives, pray to gods they barely remember, and hope their names stay buried beneath someone else's sins. But Anthony, Fat Andy, Stabile was never one of those men. He didn't flinch at shadows. He didn't lose sleep over investigations. He didn't look out windows expecting agents to pull him into the light. For most of his career, he treated law enforcement like an annoyance, some background noise that came with the territory, like traffic or construction. But the 1980s were different. The noise turned into pressure. The pressure turned into heat. And the heat turned into something even Anthony Stabile couldn't ignore. It began slowly, as all suffocations do. A few pointed questions here. A few plainclothes agents loitering there. Surveillance vans parked at unusual angles. Faces he didn't recognize in diners he visited for 30 years. Agents casually flipping their notebooks open when he walked past. None of it rattled him. Not at first. He had lived through worse. He had seen law enforcement flex before. He knew their patterns. He knew their strategies. And most importantly, he knew their limits. For decades, Anthony had avoided prosecution through the same quiet, disciplined approach that defined the rest of his criminal life. He never spoke too much, never took unnecessary risks. never placed himself in the center of operations that could be traced back to him. He was a ghost by design. But ghosts can't hide forever. The FBI had changed. New laws, new techniques, new levels of cooperation between agencies. RICO had become the government's most powerful weapon, a legal wrecking ball smashing through Mafia families that once thought themselves untouchable. Wiretaps recorded meetings that used to happen in whispers. Undercover agents infiltrated places that once felt sacred. Men who had vowed to die before breaking the code suddenly broke under the weight of 20-year sentences. And in this new world, someone like Anthony Stabile, a man with violence etched into every chapter of his life, was exactly the kind of target federal agents wanted under their microscope. It started with a truck hijacking case connected to a warehouse in Brooklyn. It wasn't Anthony's case, not directly, but one of his associates, Tommy Carbone, jittery and reckless, had been seen near the site. And federal agents followed the thread with the determination of men who had learned that small threads often led to bigger knots. Within days, they connected Tommy to Joey Pins, then Joey to Frankie Breadsticks, then Frankie to Richie DeSantis, and finally, inevitably, all of them to Anthony. Suddenly, the FBI wasn't looking at isolated crimes. They were looking at a pattern, a crew, a hierarchy, a leader, and that leader was Anthony Stabile. Agents began following him everywhere, to bars, to coffee shops, to back rooms where meetings took place under cigarette smoke and low voices. They watched him silently, patiently, waiting for the moment he slipped, waiting for him to say something, anything they could use. But Anthony never offered a word. He ordered drinks with gestures, gave instructions with glances, communicated entire strategies with silence. Agents recorded hours of conversations around him only to discover that he rarely contributed more than a nod. One rookie FBI agent wrote in a report, "Watching Anthony Stabile is like watching a statue everyone is afraid of. But statues can crack." The first real crack came when an informant, whose identity was sealed to this day, claimed Anthony had been involved in an unsolved homicide from the 1970s. The murder had been forgotten by most detectives, buried under years of paperwork, but the informant's detailed description resurrected the case. Suddenly, federal agents were digging through old files, interviewing former associates, calling retired detectives out of their quiet Florida lives, and piecing together fragments of a puzzle that pointed directly to Anthony. They couldn't arrest him. Not yet. But they could tighten the circle. And they did. One morning, Anthony walked out of his apartment building to find two FBI agents leaning against his car, arms crossed, waiting. The younger agent smiled like he was enjoying himself. The older agent didn't smile at all. Anthony approached with his usual steely calm, but his eyes narrowed. This wasn't the harmless surveillance he'd brushed aside for years. This was direct intimidation. The older agent tapped the hood of the car. "Morning, Andy. Nice day for a ride. Mind if we follow?" Anthony stared at him without speaking. The agent tilted his head. "Because we're going to follow anyway." Anthony stepped around them, opened his car door, and sat inside. But instead of starting the engine, he waited, and the agents waited with him. A silent standoff, each man refusing to blink first. Finally, Anthony turned the key, drove off, and watched through the rearview mirror as the government car pulled out behind him. That became his new normal. Everywhere he went, they followed. They followed him to supermarkets, to club entrances, to lunch counters, to doctor's appointments, to late-night meetings in quiet corners of Queens. They weren't subtle. They didn't need to be. Their message was clear. "We're here. We're watching. You're next." And Anthony, who once seemed impervious to fear, finally began to feel the pressure. But the FBI didn't just follow him. They suffocated him. They intercepted his calls. They shadowed his crew. They questioned his associates relentlessly. Every week, another young gangster would be dragged into a room with harsh lighting and a stern-faced agent asking, "When was the last time you saw Stabile?" The men always answered with the same mixture of fear and loyalty. "Don't know. Haven't seen him. Don't ask me." But cracks began to form. Joey Pins started drinking more heavily. Tommy Carbone's nerves became so bad he could barely light a cigarette without dropping the lighter. Frankie Breadsticks began avoiding meetings. Even Richie, Anthony's most loyal bulldog, grew restless, agitated by the constant pressure. And Anthony knew what pressure did to weak men. It made them talk. It made them fold. It made them betray. One night, in a small room behind a Queen's bar, Anthony gathered his crew for a meeting. He could feel the surveillance van parked down the block. He could feel the agent's eyes trained on the entrance. He could feel the desperation in the room like humidity thickening the air. His men waited for him to speak. And for the first time in years, Anthony actually talked. Not in half phrases, not in quiet nods, but in full sentences. They want to break us, he said. They want one of you to crack. They want one of you to open your mouth. They want me in a cage before the year is over. The room was silent. No one dared move. Then Anthony said something that startled even the men who had followed him for years. If anyone here talks, I won't kill you, because I won't need to. God'll take care of you long before I do. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't even said with anger. It was spoken like a prophecy, like something he believed with absolute certainty. But the prophecy didn't calm anyone's nerves. It terrified them, because men who talk about fate, destiny, and divine punishment aren't in control. They aren't grounded. They're drifting, and a drifting leader is the most dangerous kind. Meanwhile, the FBI wasn't waiting for divine justice. They had a real plan. They launched wiretaps on several bars and clubs associated with Anthony's crew. They secured warrants for hidden microphones in union offices and truck depots. They planted undercover agents near gambling operations. And they flipped minor associates with promises of reduced sentences. Little by little, the circle tightened. Agents began connecting Anthony to extortion cases, assault cases, gambling operations, and suspected homicides. They assembled charts with his name at the center, his crew branching off like veins from a dark heart. One day, agents raided a warehouse where Anthony's men once stored stolen merchandise. Anthony wasn't involved anymore, but his fingerprints had once been on the operations books years before. That didn't matter. The agents carried out boxes of old invoices, betting slips, ledgers, and photographs. Anything that might connect him to a larger criminal conspiracy. As Anthony's paranoia grew, his world shrank. He stopped going to certain bars, stopped speaking to certain men, stopped trusting the crew that once moved like extensions of his will. He spent more nights drinking alone, more days pacing his apartment, more hours staring out his window, watching for cars that didn't belong. One afternoon, he spotted an unfamiliar sedan parked near the corner. He watched it for 2 hours, then 3. When it didn't move, he walked outside, approached the car, and tapped on the window. The man inside rolled it down. An FBI badge glinted in the sunlight. "Afternoon, Andy," the agent said casually. Anthony didn't respond. He simply turned and walked back to his apartment, the realization washing over him like an icy tide. There was no escape. They were everywhere. And now, even his silence, once a shield, was failing him. By late 1984, the FBI had compiled enough circumstantial evidence to charge Anthony with several counts related to racketeering. They weren't confident enough to convict him on the murders they suspected him of, but they didn't need to. RICO allowed prosecutors to paint a picture of criminal enterprise without tying Anthony directly to every act of violence. But charging him wasn't the hard part. Proving it was. And the federal government wanted more. They wanted a confession. They wanted a flipped crew member. They wanted a witness willing to say the words. Anthony Stabile ordered it. But Anthony's crew, fractured, paranoid, terrified, still hadn't broken. Not yet. The FBI tried everything. Tailing, raids, informants, undercover stings, pressure, fear, money, promises, threats. Nothing cracked the inner circle. Because even in his weakened state, even with paranoia eating away at him, Anthony's reputation still held enough weight to keep his crew's mouth shut. But reputations don't last forever. And one quiet night, in a moment no one could have predicted, the break the FBI had been waiting for finally arrived. Not through strategy, not through threats, but through an accident of fate so sudden, so unexpected, that it would change the trajectory of Anthony Stabile's life forever. And the fall that followed will be something no amount of silence could stop. Chapter 11. Blood on the Ledger. The web of murders, suspicions, and the dead who followed him. The truth about Anthony "Fat Andy" Stabile was always buried under layers of fear, silence, and the unspoken rule that some men's crimes simply shouldn't be discussed. But by the time the 1980s pushed toward their bitter midpoint, the list of bodies confirmed, suspected, whispered about, or quietly forgotten had grown so long that even seasoned detectives struggled to keep track. And the deeper the FBI dug into Anthony's past, the more they realized something unsettling. His violence didn't belong to any single era of his life. It stretched across decades, influencing different crews, different territories, different conflicts, leaving behind a trail of victims whose stories all pointed back to the same silent enforcer who never once confessed, never once hesitated, and never once left behind a clean motive. But the murders weren't just a timeline of criminal acts. They were a window into the darker evolution of a man who started as a useful tool and slowly became something more dangerous, something impossible to control, predict, or contain. And as the FBI pieced together fragments of his history, they discovered that Anthony's legacy wasn't defined by the jobs everyone knew about, but by the deaths no one wanted to talk about. Some murders you can map like constellations, each point connecting neatly to a motive, an order, a hierarchy, a purpose. But Anthony's constellation was jagged, scattered, and disjointed. Some murders made sense. Others made no sense at all. And the ones that frightened investigators most were the ones that didn't follow the logic of mafia business. Murders that seemed driven by impulse, pressure, paranoia, or something deeper inside Anthony that had twisted over the years. The earliest homicide connected to his name was a warehouse beating from the late 1950s, the same incident that first put him on law enforcement's radar, though they could never prove his presence that night. The victim, a hijacker named Benny Lasker, had been caught stealing from a Gambino-connected shipment. His body was found 3 days later behind a row of industrial dumpsters, skull fractured, ribs snapped, fingers broken at odd angles, as if someone had methodically dismantled him piece by piece. One detective who worked the case wrote in a confidential memo, "This wasn't a message. This was a cleansing." At the time, the police suspected half a dozen men, including Anthony. But suspicion without witnesses is nothing, and men like Anthony thrived in the vacuum created by silence. As the years passed, the murder count connected, loosely or firmly, to his orbit grew. Some were cold, calculated hits clearly ordered by higher-ups. Some were heat-of-the-moment eruptions caused by tensions in bars, gambling dens, or back rooms where money and egos collided. But a pattern slowly emerged. Whenever a body turned up beaten past recognition, strangled with excessive force, or stabbed in a way that felt personal rather than professional, detectives would quietly ask themselves the same question: could this be Stabile? In one infamous case from the mid-1960s, a loan shark named Angelo Coretta disappeared after failing to repay a debt he owed the Gambino family. His disappearance was initially written off as a man fleeing responsibility. But when his body surfaced months later in a shallow grave near a creek in Staten Island, fingers missing, jaw shattered, a cord wrapped so tightly around his throat it left grooves in the bone, detectives recognized the brutality. But they couldn't confirm the killer. All they had were whispers from informants who said Anthony had handled the matter. Whispers don't convict men like Anthony Stabile. They only build legends around them. By the early 1970s, Anthony's reputation had reached a level where suspicion followed him into every case involving extreme violence. Detectives from different precincts would gather at bars after their shifts and trade stories, comparing crime scene notes like ghost hunters comparing sightings. One detective joked, half seriously, "If you see a body that looks like it fought a hurricane, check if Stabile was in town." But beneath the gallows humor was a chilling truth. The murders weren't just violent. They were efficient. And the efficiency suggested that Anthony understood something other enforcers didn't: how to kill without leaving a trail that prosecutors could follow. He never used the same method twice. He never left the same signature. He never followed a pattern that a profiler could map. His violence adapted to the environment, the victim, the moment. That fluid unpredictability made him nearly impossible to pin down. He was a chameleon of brutality. But as the Gambino family grew more organized, as Rico tightened its grip, as surveillance blanketed the city, Anthony's murders became harder to hide. Not because he changed, but because the world around him did. The new generation of detectives didn't rely on informants alone. They relied on patterns, behavioral evolution, geographic mapping, and forensic science. And when they applied these modern tools to the unsolved murders that dotted Anthony's past, connections emerged in ways no one had been able to see before. One FBI analyst created a chart that linked victims based on behavioral sequencing alone: the type of violence used, the escalation of force, the timing of the murders in relation to Mafia conflicts, and the proximity to Anthony's known locations. The chart formed a constellation that pointed to one conclusion: Anthony Stabile had likely been involved in more homicides than any associate in the Gambino family's modern history. But likely wasn't enough. Without witnesses, without forensic evidence, without confessions, the FBI was left with nothing but an expanding web of suspicion. And that web only deepened when the agency began investigating the disappearances. Victims who had never been found, never been identified, never been confirmed as dead. These cases were even more haunting. Men who had crossed the wrong line vanished into the underworld like drops of water evaporating from concrete, gone without leaving a trace. No blood, no clothing, no remains, no clues. And again, whispers put Anthony in those memories. Men swore they saw him with the victims days before they vanished. Others claimed he was sent to clean up problems that needed to be erased permanently. But in every case, any associate who came close to confirming this either denied it under pressure or disappeared themselves. The FBI kept digging. One agent, who became obsessed with Anthony, spent years interviewing retired mobsters, informants in witness protection, and detectives who had long since given up. He filled binders with notes, timelines, and speculation. And though he never cracked Anthony's shell, he came to one stark conclusion in a report circulated through the Bureau: Anthony Stabile embodies a rare criminal profile: high-functioning violence with low emotional variance. Men like him do not kill for passion or pleasure. They kill because killing feels like an extension of breathing. But as the FBI connected dots, something else became painfully clear. The murders were starting to catch up with him. Not legally, emotionally. Anthony had always carried his violence quietly, packing it away in the same mental compartments he stored everything else. But now those compartments were deteriorating. The cracks from Chapter 9 were widening. The weight of the bodies, not just literal, but psychological, was pulling him downward. His hands trembled more. His stare lingered longer. His silence grew heavier, darker, more suffocating. At night, he began waking in cold sweats, startled by sounds that weren't threats: pipes settling, cars driving by, footsteps from upstairs neighbors. For a man who once slept through chaos, these small noises were telltale signs that something inside him was fracturing. Even his crew felt it. They watched him drift through meetings like a ghost, barely acknowledging their updates, barely responding to questions. When they brought him problems, he didn't offer solutions. He offered silence. And silence, once his greatest weapon, had now become a liability. The paranoia that had plagued him deepened as he realized how many men in the city remembered his violence. Every gambling den, every pool hall, every quiet alley in Queens held echoes of men who had died under his fists or stared into his cold eyes moments before their end. And paranoia does not require guilt to grow. It requires only imagination. And Anthony's imagination was now tainted by cocaine, distrust, fatigue, and the ghosts of his own making. The tipping point came when an informant, anonymous, protected, and motivated by self-preservation, testified that Anthony had ordered a murder in the late 1970s over a gambling dispute. The case resurfaced like a long-buried body, clawing its way back to the surface. Detectives dug through old autopsy reports, old interviews, old crime scenes. And even though the evidence was circumstantial, it was enough to bring Anthony into the interrogation room for the first serious time in his life. They sat him down, offered him coffee, asked him questions, told him they knew everything. But Anthony said nothing, not a word, not even a blink of acknowledgement. One agent leaned close and whispered, "You've killed more men than you can remember." Anthony lifted his eyes, and, for the first time, there was something behind them. Exhaustion. He wasn't breaking. He was fading, and that terrified the agents more than anger ever could. When Anthony walked out of that interrogation room, he was a different man than the one who walked in, because he knew something the agents couldn't confirm, something that wasn't written in any report, something only he could feel. The past had finally caught up, not through evidence, not through witnesses, not through confessions, but through time. Time had eroded the shell he once wore like armor. Time had amplified the whispers into roars. Time had turned suspicion into inevitability. And time was beginning to pull him toward an ending no mobster ever wants. A death not by assassination or arrest, but by the weight of his own ghosts. And those ghosts were just beginning to gather around him, waiting for him to crack under the memory of the blood he had spent his life pretending didn't matter. Chapter 12. When Loyalty Cracks. Arrests, Betrayals, and the Beginning of the End. The Mafia teaches one lesson above all else. Loyalty is survival. Loyalty is currency. Loyalty is the thin thread that holds everything together. But the truth, the dark truth men like Anthony, Fat Andy, Stabile learned too late, is that loyalty is only real until pressure comes. After that, it becomes a myth, something men pretend to hold until the alternative becomes a prison cell, a federal trial, or a shallow grave. And in the early 1980s, as the FBI tightened its grip and the Mafia's golden age crumbled under the weight of indictments and paranoia, the world Anthony had ruled through fear began to betray him one crack at a time. The beginning of the end didn't arrive with a dramatic raid or a gun pointed at his chest. It arrived with something far quieter. A phone call, a rumor, a message whispered in the back of a bar. One of Anthony's own associates had been picked up by federal agents. Not for murder, not for extortion, not for anything that would immediately trace back to Anthony. No, the arrest had been for something small. A truck hijacking charge involving a disputed pallet of electronics from a warehouse in Brooklyn. On any other day, it would have been a non-event, a minor hiccup, a routine arrest that could be handled with a lawyer and a stack of cash. But the world wasn't the same anymore, and neither was the FBI. Under RICO, small charges could be spun into larger webs. One associate arrested could become one associate pressured. One associate pressured could become one associate flipped. And one flipped associate was all it took to put Anthony in the crosshairs. The arrested man was Tommy Carbone, the jittery, wide-eyed member of Anthony's crew who had always been the weakest link. Tommy wasn't built for pressure. He wasn't built for jail cells or interrogation rooms or the cold efficiency of federal agents who spend entire careers studying how to break men like him. Richie could have handled it. Frankie could have handled it. Joey could have handled it. But Tommy? Tommy was a trembling fuse just waiting for a spark. And the FBI gave him all the sparks he needed. Anthony found out about the arrest late in the evening, while sitting alone at a diner he'd frequented for decades. The waitress placed a cup of coffee in front of him and said quietly, "2 men came looking for you earlier." Anthony didn't ask who. He didn't need to. He stirred his coffee slowly, watching the cream swirl through the darkness like a storm forming inside a teacup. And for a moment, the clatter of dishes, the chatter of patrons, the hum of the neon sign outside, it all faded into nothing. All he could feel was a pressure building behind his ribs, tightening like a fist. He stood up, left money on the counter, and walked out into the cooling night air. By the time he reached the corner, 2 black sedans were parked just far enough away to look inconspicuous. and just close enough to make their intentions obvious. The FBI wasn't hiding anymore. They wanted him to know they were there. That night, Anthony drove to the bar where his men usually gathered. But tonight, the bar felt wrong the moment he walked through the door. The conversations stopped too abruptly. The smiles were too forced. The atmosphere was too thick. His crew looked at him like he had become a ghost. Something once familiar, but now haunting. Unpredictable. Dangerous. Richie was the first to approach him. His face was hard, his jaw clenched, his eyes full of something Anthony rarely saw in him. Uncertainty. "Tommy's not talking," Richie said. They pulled him in. "But he's not talking." Anthony nodded, but he didn't believe it. Not fully. Men always said the same thing in the early hours of an arrest. "He's solid. He won't break. He's one of us." But the Mafia graveyards were filled with men who had said the same things. Right before someone flipped, or cracked, or whispered a name to save their own skin. Anthony sat down at the back table. Frankie Breadsticks joined him moments later, expression calm, but colder than usual. Joey Pin stood beside the jukebox, pretending to choose a song, but watching Anthony's reflection in the glass. Hound lingered near the entrance, listening for the door, as if expecting trouble. For the first time, Anthony felt something strange from his own men. Distance. Not fear. Fear had always been there. But distance. A quiet shift in the air that made him realize something terrifying. His authority was no longer absolute. Paranoia had eaten away at his silence. The FBI had eaten away at his power. And Tommy's arrest had eaten away at whatever unity the crew still clung to. Richie sat across from him and leaned forward. "Boss, what do you want us to do?" Anthony stared at him, lost in a thought he couldn't fully articulate. His voice, when it finally emerged, was quiet, almost fragile. "Nothing. We wait." Richie blinked. "Wait. We wait," Anthony repeated. It was the first time he had ever said something that resembled surrender. Not surrender to the FBI. Not surrender to his crew. Surrender to the truth none of them wanted to face. The world was changing faster than Anthony could hold it together. And the cracks in loyalty were finally starting to widen. 2 days later, the FBI released Tommy Carbone pending further investigation. On paper, it was routine. In practice, it was a message. When a man is arrested, questioned, and then released quickly, everyone asked the same question. What did he give them? Tommy walked back into the bar looking like a man with a noose around his neck. His eyes were red. His hands shook. His voice cracked when he spoke. The crew stiffened around him, each one waiting for the moment Anthony would react. Anthony didn't move. He stared at Tommy, so long the man's breathing turned erratic. Tommy knew what that look meant. Everyone did. In the Mafia, silence wasn't calm. Silence was judgment. Silence was a verdict waiting to fall. Tommy tried to speak, tried to defend himself, tried to explain what the agents asked, how he answered, how he said nothing, how he stayed loyal. But the more he spoke, the more Anthony drifted inward, eyes unfocused, expression unreadable. Finally, Anthony stood up, and the entire bar froze. He stepped toward Tommy slowly, deliberately. Tommy flinched when Anthony reached out, but all Anthony did was place a hand on the man's shoulder. "Get some rest," he said. Tommy choked on a breath. "Andy, I swear, I didn't say anything." Anthony nodded once. "I know," but he didn't know. And everyone in the room felt that uncertainty like a knife pressed against the back of their necks. Tommy left the bar, and the moment the door closed, Richie turned to Anthony and said quietly, "You know he's not solid anymore. You know he's going to fold." Anthony didn't answer, because the truth was, he didn't need to. The cracks were widening, not just in Tommy, not just in the crew, in Anthony himself. The drugs, the paranoia, the pressure, the fear he refused to acknowledge. It all combined into something volatile and dangerous. A man who could still kill with precision, but could no longer see who was worth killing. And the FBI exploited those cracks mercilessly. They tailgate Anthony's car until he ran red lights. They questioned shop owners who paid him. They followed his mother to church. They showed up at his sister's house, pretending to look for a missing person. They left business cards on his car windshield. They walked into the bar and ordered drinks just to remind him they were watching. Each tactic dug deeper into his mind. Each silent accusation pulled him further from reality. One night, after being followed home, Anthony sat in his apartment with all the lights off, the glow of the street lamps casting long shadows across the walls. He poured himself a drink and stared at the reflection in the window. He saw a man he didn't recognize. Not the enforcer, not the feared killer, not the legend. He saw a man aging too fast, weighed down by suspicion, nerves frayed by cocaine, heart tightening under the pressure of a world he no longer controlled. The next day, Richie found him sitting alone in the bar before it opened. Anthony didn't speak, didn't even look up. Richie sat beside him, waiting for instructions that never came. Finally, Anthony said, "They're tightening the net." Richie grunted. "Let them. We're not rats." But Anthony shook his head slowly. "It's not us I'm worried about." He didn't say Tommy's name. He didn't have to. The crew began fracturing. Frankie started staying home more. Joey took fewer risks. Hunt avoided meetings. Tommy showed up less and less, afraid of Anthony's gaze. Even Richie, a man who once followed Anthony without hesitation, began questioning his leadership behind closed doors. In a world where silence had once been Anthony's most powerful tool, now it only created suspicion. And suspicion is poison. The FBI sensed the weakness. They began pressing harder, offering deals, reduced sentences, protection programs, immunity agreements. And with each offer, another thread in the Mafia's fabric snapped. The dam finally burst when another associate, someone loosely tied to Anthony's outer circle, flipped. His testimony named several murders, extortions, illegal gambling operations. And while he didn't directly implicate Anthony in every act, the implication was clear. The crew was falling apart. Anthony received the news sitting in his car outside a deli. Richie delivered it with a quiet, heavy voice. Someone talked. Anthony didn't react. Not at first. He simply closed his eyes and breathed out slowly. His hands tightened on the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. For the first time in decades, Richie saw something he never expected to see in Anthony Stabile. Not rage, not fear, resignation, a whisper of inevitability. The walls were closing in, and the men he once controlled through silence and violence were now slipping through his fingers like smoke. The FBI had cracked the circle, not through intimidation, but through time. And time was the one enemy Anthony could never beat. He drove away that night without telling Richie where he was going. He didn't return for 2 days. When he finally walked back into the bar, he looked older, thinner, diminished. Not defeated. Not yet. But close. Close in a way that the crew recognized immediately. Things were changing. The world was shifting. And Anthony Stabile, the man once too feared to be crossed, was now living on borrowed loyalty, borrowed time, and borrowed strength. And the betrayal that would push him past the point of no return was still waiting in the shadows, ready to strike. Because when loyalty cracks, the collapse is never slow. It's sudden, it's violent, and it destroys everything in its path. Chapter 13, the final slide, illness, isolation, and a kingdom that never existed. There's a point in every mobster's life when the fear he once commanded turns into something else entirely. An echo, a memory, a fading shadow that clings to walls long after the man himself begins to disappear. For Anthony Fat Andy Stabile, that moment didn't arrive with bullets or betrayal or a dramatic fall from grace. It arrived quietly, slowly, like rot beneath floorboards. Not with a bang, but a slow, grinding erosion that stripped away the myth long before it touched the man. By the mid-1980s, Anthony Stabile, once a living nightmare in Queens and Brooklyn, found himself confronting something far more terrifying than law enforcement or rival crews. Time, age, illness, and the realization that his own body had begun turning against him. The first signs came in ways only the deeply observant would catch. Small hesitations in his movements, a stiffness in his gait, a cough he couldn't shake no matter how many cigarettes he smoked or how much liquor he poured down his throat to drown the burning in his chest. At first, His crew wrote it off as exhaustion. The man barely slept anymore. The stress of the FBI, the paranoia, the betrayals, these were enough to wear down anyone. But in Anthony's case, something else had settled inside him. Something that began eating him from within long before he acknowledged its existence. He stopped showing up regularly at the bar that had once served as the headquarters for his crew. Days passed, then weeks where no one saw him. Richie, concerned but too proud to show it, drove past Anthony's apartment more frequently, convinced something was wrong, but unwilling to knock on the door and risk appearing weak in front of the man he had idolized for so long. Joey Pins, always the coldest of the group, quietly reassured the others that Anthony was just thinking things through, but even he felt the unsettling truth beneath his own words. Frankie Breadsticks visited once and said nothing afterward. Hound disappeared for several days after stopping by Anthony's place, returning pale and shaken, refusing to talk about what he'd seen. And Tommy Carbone, barely holding himself together under the pressure of the FBI, simply avoided the subject entirely, terrified that even mentioning Anthony's name aloud might summon something he didn't want to face. The truth was simple. Anthony was dying. Slowly, quietly, and in typical Anthony fashion, without complaint. He had always carried pain like a secret. He had always lived in silence. Now he was dying the same way. When Richie finally forced himself to knock on Anthony's apartment door, he heard a cough on the other side. A weak one. A cough that didn't belong to the man he'd known most of his life. When the door opened, the sight nearly knocked the breath out of him. Anthony looked thin, shockingly thin. His once heavy frame had melted away, leaving behind a gaunt outline held together by muscle memory alone. His cheeks were hollow, his eyes sunken, his skin a pale, grayish tone that hinted at something far worse than exhaustion. Richie froze, unable to hide his horror. Anthony, ever perceptive, read the reaction instantly and responded with a dry, humorless smirk. "What's the matter, Rich? You look like you saw a ghost." Richie tried to laugh. It came out strangled. "You're losing weight," he managed. Anthony shrugged. "The food here sucks." It was a lie, and both of them knew it. Inside the apartment, the air smelled faintly of medicine, cigarettes, and something metallic, the scent of illness clinging to the furniture like a stain. Richie noticed pill bottles scattered across a small table. Some were empty. Some were half full. All were ignored. Anthony wasn't a man who embraced treatment. He wasn't a man who admitted weakness. And he certainly wasn't a man who trusted doctors. The sickness had started in his lungs, a relentless, consuming cancer born from decades of cigarettes, stress, poor sleep, and a life lived under the weight of violence. The kind of cancer that spreads quietly until it's too late. The kind that even the strongest men can't fight with grit alone. Anthony didn't tell the crew. He didn't tell the family. He didn't tell anyone. He chose to face it alone, as he had faced everything else. But isolation doesn't just come from illness. It comes from fear. Fear that the world will see you differently, that weakness will ruin the myth, that the violence that once defined you becomes meaningless when your own body refuses to obey. And for Anthony Stabile, the myth was all he had left. But the Mafia had already moved on from him. The Gambino family, once dependent on his brutality to control the streets, had grown weary of the chaos, the unpredictability, the attention. Men like Anthony belonged to another era, an era of iron fists and dark alleys and messages delivered with fists instead of words. The new generation wanted earners, negotiators, men who spoke the language of unions and business fronts and white-collar crime, men who knew how to launder money instead of blood. Anthony was a relic, a dangerous relic, but a relic nonetheless. He felt the shift the moment he stopped receiving calls from captains who once needed him at all hours. He felt it when lieutenants began sending other men to handle situations that once required his presence. He felt it when the envelope of cash, once thick and frequent, began thinning out, first slowly, then drastically. Men who once trembled at the sound of his footsteps now avoided the places he used to haunt, terrified of being dragged into the storm of surveillance and investigations that followed him like a curse. The Mafia doesn't retire its soldiers. It lets them fade. Quietly. Efficiently. Cruelly. And Anthony was fading. He spent more time alone in his apartment, watching dust settle on furniture he no longer cared to clean. He spent more nights staring at the ceiling, listening to the coughing fits that tore through his lungs like claws. He spent more mornings wondering if the pain in his chest was the beginning of the end. Every day felt like a long, quiet surrender. But the deepest isolation came not from sickness or from the Mafia withdrawing their support. It came from his crew. Men who had once lived in his shadow now lived with fear, guilt, and resentment. They avoided him not out of disrespect, but out of discomfort, because seeing him weaken was like watching the collapse of a myth they relied on to define themselves. Richie visited the most. Joey visited only once more. Frankie offered a few quiet nods before disappearing. Tommy visited twice, each time trembling, each time rambling nervously, each time running away the moment Anthony's eyes lingered too long on him. And Hound, the quietest and most perceptive of the group, left the city entirely, understanding what the others refused to say aloud. When a man like Anthony begins to die, the entire underworld reorganizes itself around the vacuum he leaves behind. Even the FBI sensed the end. The surveillance thinned. The pressure eased. It wasn't the mercy of law enforcement. It was strategy. Why waste resources on a dying man? Anthony noticed the shift the same way a wounded animal senses predators losing interest. But the loss of pressure didn't free him. It suffocated him in a new way. Because for the first time in his adult life, the silence no longer felt like power. It felt like erasure. He had spent decades building a reputation carved in fear. But fear dissipates quickly when its source begins to shrink. One night, as he lay on the couch struggling to catch his breath, a memory rose in his mind with startling clarity. The face of a man he'd beaten nearly to death decades earlier. Not because he regretted it. Regret wasn't in his vocabulary. But because the man's terrified eyes reminded him of something he had forgotten. His own mortality. That moment had been a warning. One he ignored. One he buried. One he now recalled with a bitter twist of understanding. He had become a man lying on the ground. He was the one gasping. He was the one fading. Death wasn't hunting him. It was already in the room. The only question left was how much dignity he could hold on to before the end. But dignity is a luxury the Mafia rarely gives its dying men. Word eventually spread across the underworld that Anthony was sick, very sick. And as that word spread, the last traces of loyalty evaporated. Men who owed him money stopped paying. Men who once feared him now spoke about him openly, recounting stories with theatrical bravado rather than trembling recollection. Younger gangsters laughed at the tales of an enforcer they'd never met, calling him old school, a dinosaur, a ghost. Even the Gambino family offered nothing. No protection, no financial support, no acknowledgement. Anthony had once been a weapon. Now he was an afterthought. But the cruelest blow came near the end, when Richie, the last man still loyal enough to visit, arrived at the apartment only to find Anthony missing. Panic surged. He searched the neighborhood, called other crew members, contacted old friends. Hours passed. Then a neighbor mentioned seeing Anthony being taken away by paramedics the previous night. Richie found him in a hospital bed surrounded by machines and tubes, his breathing shallow, his eyes dull but aware. Anthony didn't speak for a long time. Richie sat beside him, gripping the railing, waiting for the silence to break. Finally, Anthony whispered, "Tell me the truth, Rich." Richie swallowed hard. About what? Did they forget me? Richie didn't know how to respond. He wasn't a liar. Not to Anthony. So he reached for a lie that felt close enough to truth to pass. They didn't forget, he said quietly. The life just moves on. Anthony closed his eyes, and for the first time in his life, the silence felt like defeat, not strength. He died not long after, the final breaths leaving his body quietly, without ceremony, without witnesses, without the fear he had once commanded gathering at his bedside. No crowd, no entourage, no captain sending flowers. The Mafia doesn't mourn its tools. The funeral was small, shockingly small. A handful of relatives. A priest who barely knew his name. Richie standing in the back, hands trembling. No soldiers. No made men. No bosses. No one from the family he had bled for. The myth had ended. The man had ended long before that. And all that remained was a legacy no one wanted to claim. A legacy of violence, fear, and silence. But what Richie noticed most was not the lack of mourners. It was the lack of shadows. Anthony Stabile, the man once too dangerous for Hollywood to portray, was buried without a single figure watching from a distance. No rivals. No investigators. No ghosts. It was as if the world had already let him go. And yet, in a quiet, unsettling way, something still felt unfinished. Because endings like Anthony's don't arrive clean. They leave embers. They leave rumors. They leave unanswered questions. They leave pieces of a story that refuse to settle into the ground. And those pieces were already beginning to stir, ready to shape the final chapter of a life built on violence, silence, and the fear of a man no one ever truly knew. Chapter 14. Death of a Mobster, the quiet end of a loud life. There are deaths in the Mafia that roar across the underworld like thunder, assassinations that shake families, betrayals that end bloodlines, executions that echo through alleys and whispered conversations for decades. And then there are deaths like Anthony, Fat Andy, Stabile's, silent, anticlimactic, almost eerie in their stillness. A man who once defined danger, whose presence could suffocate a room, whose name traveled through neighborhoods like a curse, fading out in a hospital bed with no fanfare, no gunfire, no alarms. Just breath turning to air, air turning to nothing. But the quiet didn't make his death peaceful, only haunting. Because a man like Anthony doesn't simply slip away. His end creates a vacuum, a dissonance, a strange emptiness that makes everyone who knew him ask the same question. How does a life built on so much violence end in such a small, soft moment? The weeks leading up to Anthony's death were a blur of fever, coughing fits, and long stretches of half-sleep, where the world outside his hospital window became a distant, abstract concept. Nurses who treated him remembered a man who said very little but watched everything. Doors, hallways, machines, shadows on the floor. Even as his body weakened, the instinct for survival flickered behind his eyes. He didn't trust anyone. Even dying, he didn't know how. Lung cancer had hollowed him out. It had been eating at him for months, years if doctors were honest. But Anthony had faced it the same way he faced everything else. Denial, silence, avoidance. A lifetime of cigarettes, stress, late nights, cheap whiskey, and violence finally collected the debt he'd ignored for too long. And when the cancer reached his bones, his breathing became ragged, his heart strained, and his strength evaporated faster than anyone expected. The FBI, once relentless in their pursuit, had long since stepped back. They knew he was dying. They knew he was no longer a threat. They knew pressing him now would be nothing short of cruelty. But cruelty had never stopped the Bureau before. What stopped them now was irrelevance. A dying man couldn't testify, couldn't betray, couldn't rebuild a crew, couldn't reignite old fires. To the FBI, Anthony had become something they never imagined he could be. Harmless. Even the Gambino family, who once relied on the force of his violence to control the streets, barely registered his decline. He had been fading from their world for years. They had new problems, new wars, new alliances. Men like John Gotti now commanded attention. Men who controlled unions and rackets and political ties. Men who made headlines instead of bodies. The era of the blunt enforcer was over. Anthony was a relic, a reminder of a previous generation's brutality. As his days dwindled, Anthony slipped deeper into solitude. Nurses watched him stare at the ceiling for hours at a time, unmoving, unreadable. He didn't ask for family. He didn't ask for friends. He didn't ask for anyone. Once, a nurse gently asked, "Is there anyone you'd like us to call?" Anthony looked at her with a blank expression, as if the concept of companionship were foreign. Then he shook his head and whispered, "No one." He wasn't lying. Word of his illness circulated through the underworld, but no one visited. Not because they didn't care, but because caring was dangerous. Showing up at the bedside of a dying enforcer signaled connection. Connection signaled involvement. Involvement signaled liability. No one wanted to be associated with a man the FBI had spent years trying to break. No one wanted questions. No one wanted attention. And truthfully, no one wanted to see what had become of him. Men like Anthony are supposed to die in alleys or back rooms or at the wrong end of a bullet. They don't die with tubes in their arms and hospital sheets wrapped around their thinning bodies. That kind of vulnerability unsettles the mythology. It forces men to confront the truth that even the most feared killers are mortal. Flesh, bone, fragile. Richie was the only one who visited more than once. The big, hulking enforcer who once stood at Anthony's shoulder like a living shield now found himself sitting in a plastic hospital chair, elbows on his knees, trying to hold back emotions he didn't understand. He'd known Anthony most of his life. He'd feared him. He'd idolized him. He'd followed him. And now he didn't know what to say. The first visit ended with Richie staring at the floor, while Anthony's shallow breathing filled the silence. The second visit ended with Richie forcing a laugh that broke halfway through the sound. The third visit, that was the worst. "Bunch of guys been a skin about you," Richie lied. Anthony turned his head slightly, an almost imperceptible motion, and whispered, "No, they ain't." Richie didn't respond, because the truth was sharper than any blade they'd ever held. Anthony wasn't needed anymore. And in the Mafia, the moment you're not needed, you're dead already. There were nights when Anthony drifted into fevered dreams, visions born from a lifetime soaked in violence. Nurses heard him mumbling names under his breath. Some they recognized, some they didn't. Once, he muttered, "I didn't mean to," though no one knew what he was referring to. Another night, he whispered, "It wasn't supposed to be this," as if confronting the crumbling ruins of a life he'd never tried to build properly. Regret wasn't something Anthony allowed himself, but regret has a way of seeping through even the strongest walls when the body begins to fail. By the time the priest came to offer last rites, a courtesy arranged by a distant cousin, Anthony was too weak to speak. The priest prayed beside him, his voice steady, gentle, hopeful. Anthony's eyes remained half open, unfocused, as if staring at something the priest could not see. When the prayer ended, the priest placed a hand on Anthony's forehead and whispered, "May God have mercy on your soul." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Mercy had never been part of Anthony's vocabulary. He died a few days later, quietly, without pain medication. He'd refused it, without ceremony, without family holding his hand, without friends waiting in the hallway. He died as he lived, alone, silent, in the dark space between fear and indifference. Word of his death traveled quickly, but the reaction was shockingly subdued. No gatherings, no toasts, no bars closing in his honor. Men who had once run from him now shrugged, muttering, "I thought he died years ago." Others remembered his cruelty and said nothing at all. A few old-timers nodded solemnly and murmured, "End of an era," though they weren't sure which era they were talking about anymore. His funeral was small, painfully small. A handful of relatives, a scattering of curious faces from the neighborhood, and Richie, standing at a distance from the casket, as if unsure whether he belonged among the mourners. The priest read from Scripture. The air smelled like wet earth and lilies. Rain tapped softly on the canopy above the burial site. No made men came. No captains. No soldiers. Not even a soldier. Anthony Stabile, once a feared figure in one of the most powerful Mafia families in America, was lowered into the ground like an afterthought. Even the cemetery felt indifferent. As the dirt fell onto the coffin, Richie stood frozen, jaw clenched so tightly it trembled. He wanted to say something, wanted to acknowledge the man who had shaped his life, wanted to mark the moment with a word, a gesture, anything. But the right words didn't exist. How do you mourn a man who created so much fear? How do you honor a man who ruined lives? How do you grieve someone you admired and feared equally? In the end, Richie said nothing at all. Silence felt like the only language Anthony would have understood. After the funeral, life in the underworld moved on instantly. The Gambino family continued its operations. Crews shifted. Power changed hands. New faces replaced old ones. Businesses rose and fell. And the memory of Anthony Stabile faded like cigarette smoke in a breeze. For investigators, his death was frustrating. They had hoped to pin unsolved murders on him, interrogate him one last time, squeeze out confessions, or leverage his downfall into something bigger. But death sealed every door. Dead men don't testify. Dead men don't confess. Dead men don't talk. For the FBI, Anthony's death was the closing of a file. Not justice, not closure, just paperwork. For his crew, his death was a strange relief. The paranoia, the pressure, the expectation of loyalty, they all evaporated. Some drifted into normal life. Some stayed in the life, but kept their heads down. Some fled the city entirely. For Richie, it was more complicated. He found himself visiting the grave once, then never again. The sight of the headstone made something inside him twist. A mixture of grief, fear, and a strange, lingering loyalty that didn't make sense anymore. He whispered, "You should have gone out different," before walking away. But the truth is, Anthony died exactly the way a man like him was always going to die. Not in a blaze of glory. Not in a hail of bullets. Not with the respect of his peers or the fear of his enemies. He died quietly, forgotten by the world he once dominated, abandoned by the family he once served, overshadowed by an era that no longer needed men like him. A man built on violence, undone by time. A man defined by silence, consumed by in the end. Yet even in death, one final question lingered in the underworld. A question whispering through the bars and back rooms where men still talk about the old days. If someone like Anthony Stabile could simply fade away, then what does that mean for the legends of the Mafia? What does it mean when the most feared men leave nothing behind at all? The answer, unsettling and incomplete, waited quietly in the shadows, ready to shape the final chapter of a life the world tried so hard to forget. Chapter 15, Legacy of a Ghost. The myth, the silence, and the man Hollywood buried. Legacy is a strange and fragile thing. Some men spend their lives chasing it, chasing headlines, chasing power, chasing the kind of notoriety that carves their name into history whether the world wants it there or not. Others stumble into it by accident, leaving behind stories that grow bigger and bolder with every retelling. But then there are men like Anthony, Fat Andy, Stabile, whose legacy is something far more contradictory. A legend built not on fame or fortune, but on silence. A man whose story everyone knew, yet no one spoke aloud. And in the end, a man whose entire existence was intentionally erased by Hollywood, buried beneath a single fleeting mention in Goodfellas, because the truth was simply too dark to film. But to understand Anthony's legacy, you have to understand the world that shaped him, and the world he shaped in return. For decades, the Mafia thrived on men like him, blunt instruments of violence, silent enforcers who kept the engines running behind the glitz and glamour. They weren't the stars of the stories. They weren't the men in the tailored suits sitting at the head of the table. They weren't the smooth talkers who negotiated union contracts or delivered political favors. They were the shadow dwellers, the ones who cleaned up the mess, enforced the rules, and reminded the streets who held the real power. In that sense, Anthony was the Mafia's purest creation, a man molded by violence, perfected through silence, and feared enough to keep entire neighborhoods in line without raising his voice. But legacy isn't just shaped by what a man does. It's shaped by what the world chooses to remember. And the world chose to forget Anthony Stabile, not out of disrespect, out of necessity, because the truth of who he was, the real truth, didn't fit the Mafia mythology Hollywood was eager to sell. The Mafia Hollywood wanted was charming, colorful, charismatic. The Mafia Anthony belonged to was brutal, humorless, unforgiving. The Mafia Hollywood portrayed had characters with arcs, redemption, emotion. Anthony had none of those things. He was a straight line of violence stretching across decades, unmoved by empathy, untouched by introspection, unsoftened by any redeeming qualities. There was no tragedy in him, no moral conflict, no cinematic catharsis. He was a real mobster, and real mobsters are rarely filmable. When Martin Scorsese made Goodfellas, the production dug through countless old files, transcripts, interviews, FBI memos, and informant testimonies. They built a world that felt authentic not because it captured every truth, but because it captured the emotional truth of what it felt like to live in that world. But some truths were too dangerous, too graphic, too unresolved, or too sensitive to depict. And Anthony's story hovered like a ghost over that entire narrative. His name appears in the film only briefly, spoken casually, almost dismissed. A name among names, a background detail. But that dismissal wasn't an accident. It was a choice, a deliberate one, because the real Anthony Stabile's violence connected to unsolved murders, missing persons cases, sealed investigations, and still living families who never received closure. Bringing him to life on screen risked lawsuits, political pressure, and public outrage. But more than that, portraying him accurately would have shattered the balance of the film. It would have pulled the audience out of the narrative and forced them to confront a level of brutality that cinema prefers to sidestep. There was no charm in Anthony, no humor, no warmth, nothing that could anchor him within a story built partly on the seductive appeal of the Mafia lifestyle. So they buried him. But legacy doesn't die because a film chooses silence. Legacy survives in whispers, in rumors, in the memories of men who once trembled under his stare, in the bodies left behind in alleys, in the panic he stirred without trying, in the cautionary tales told by old-timers who would lower their voices when his name came up, as if speaking too loudly might summon him back. His legacy lived on in the way detectives described certain crime scenes where the brutality seemed excessive, the injuries too personal, the violence too precise. "Looks like a Stabile job," they would mutter, not because they had proof, but because they felt it. Violence has fingerprints even when the killer leaves none. His legacy lived on in the way young gangsters avoided certain bars, certain corners, certain memories, because the ghosts of the men Anthony killed still lingered in those places like cold drafts in winter. His legacy lived on in the way his crew collapsed after his death, not in dramatic betrayals, but in quiet unravelings. Men once bound by fear drifted apart, their loyalty dissolving the moment the force that held them together disappeared. Richie, Joey, Frankie, Tommy, Hound, each survived in their own ways, but none were ever the same. Some died quietly, some disappeared, some left the life entirely. Anthony's absence broke them in ways his presence never did. And maybe that is his legacy, too. Because in the Mafia, fear is glue. When the fear is gone, so is the structure. But Anthony's legacy is not just the violence he inflicted. It is also the silence that followed him long after death. The silence of a funeral almost no one attended. The silence of a grave barely visited. The silence of case files left unresolved. The silence of men who chose to forget rather than remember what he had done. There's another piece to his legacy, one most people overlook. Anthony was not a powerful man, not in the traditional sense. He didn't run unions. He didn't control major rackets. He didn't make millions. He didn't command soldiers from a leather chair in a back office. He wasn't a strategist. He wasn't a thinker. He wasn't a leader. He was, by Mafia standards, expendable. And yet, somehow, he became unforgettable. Because power in the Mafia isn't just measured in money or titles. It's measured in fear. And Anthony was fear given flesh. He wasn't the kind of man people told their kids about. He was the kind of man people warned their kids about. The kind of figure who made entire blocks go quiet when he walked through. The kind of presence that left grown men shaking long after he'd left the room. The kind of reputation that survived longer than his body ever could. But what does legacy mean when it leaves behind nothing to admire, nothing to emulate, nothing to cherish? Legacy, in Anthony's case, becomes a question, an unsettling one, a question that haunts the edges of every story about him. How can a man so feared, so violent, so unavoidable, vanish so completely? Because that is the paradox of Anthony Stabile. He lived like a giant. He died like a ghost. And he was remembered like a rumor. To understand this paradox fully, you have to return to the way he lived his final years. The isolation, the paranoia, the illness, the silent dinners in empty apartments, the crew dissolving around him, the FBI gathering outside his window, not as adversaries, but as spectators to a tragedy they no longer cared to influence. For most mobsters, the end comes violently. But Anthony's end was quiet, almost poetic. And in that quiet, something important about legacy becomes clear. Some men are remembered because they fought, others because they loved, others because they built. But men like Anthony are remembered because they remind the world of what violence looks like when stripped of glamour. They remind us that the Mafia isn't charming, isn't stylish, isn't honorable. It's lonely, it's brutal, it's empty. Anthony's entire life is proof of that. Every chapter, every body, every silence, every fear, every cigarette he smoked in darkened rooms. Every night he walked through the streets believing he was invincible. Every morning he woke up with his hands stained, figuratively or literally, with the past. And when he died, all of that vanished. But legacy has a strange way of resurfacing in the unlikeliest places. Old detectives still speak about him. Old mobsters still curse his name. Historians still discover footnotes about him. And audiences still feel the pull of his absence when watching Goodfellas, wondering why a man mentioned so briefly had such an outsized impact on the story behind the scenes. Anthony's legacy is a reminder that sometimes the most dangerous men are the ones who remain invisible, the ones who live in shadows, the ones who kill quietly, the ones who influence events without acknowledgments, the ones whose presence lingers long after the world stops speaking their names. But legacy is also shaped by absence. And Anthony's absence, his near erasure from Mafia history books, from Hollywood, from the public consciousness, is as telling as anything he ever did. It reflects a truth most people don't want to confront. Some men should be forgotten, not because forgetting is mercy, but because remembering forces the world to face the darkest corners of itself. Anthony Stabile's story is not a tragedy, not a cautionary tale, not a redemption arc. It is a void, a silent crater left behind by a life built on brutality. And yet, in that void lies the most honest portrait of Mafia life ever captured. Because once the glamour fades, once the smoke clears, once the last whispers die, the truth remains. This life does not end with glory. It ends with graves no one visits. It ends with stories no one finishes. It ends with men like Anthony, alone, forgotten, buried under dirt that erases the memory of every scream, every secret, every crime. But in that same darkness, a strange form of immortality lingers. Because as long as the Mafia exists, its ghost exists too. And Anthony Stabile, too violent for Hollywood, too dangerous for even the Mafia to fully embrace, too silent to leave behind confessions, remains one of those ghosts. A shadow drifting through the history of organized crime. A whisper in backrooms. A reminder that fear, not fame, is the most powerful legacy of all. And as long as men gather to tell stories of the old days, someone will always ask, in a low voice, as if afraid to wake the dead, whatever happened to Fat Andy? And in that moment, the ghost of Anthony Stabile breathes again, silent, nameless, enduring. A legacy built not on who he was, but on what everyone feared he might be.